Hello, everyone. I think we should be live now, and we're streaming both on YouTube and on Twitch. And you can find this at twitch.tv/moderate rebels. For anyone who watches or listens to this show, you'll probably recognize me. I'm Ben Norton, and I'm joined by a guest today who is a very good friend of mine and a good friend of my colleague Max. Max Blumenthal is going through some really incredible things right now, so he couldn't participate. But fortunately, we're joined by like the kind of de facto unofficial third member of Moderate Rebels, and that's Diego Sequera. How you doing, Diego?
Hey Ben, thanks for having me. Everything's
Yeah,
good here.
good, good.
Crazy but good.
Yeah, yeah. Well, when Diego says here, he's talking about Caracas, the capital of Venezuela.
That's right.
Diego Diego is an amazing journalist and a political analyst, one of the smartest political analysts I know of, who has really good insight. And you should definitely check out his website. It's called Misión Verdad. And they do have an English language version as well. So, obviously today we're going to be speaking in English because most of our audience is English speaking. So, Diego, do you want to talk a little bit about what Misión Verdad is while we get started here?
Well, sure, man. Thanks. Well, Misión Verdad, it's already how long? 9 years old project. Started in 2000. 8-year old project. Sorry, it started in 2013. Pretty much close to when Maduro reaches power. I mean, in its website form, it has dedicated itself to ever since to, well, unconventional warfare, geopolitics, and bringing over a discussion in Venezuela that was actually not too much developed in time. So it was like catching up on some conversations that actually weren't still. That is one point. They weren't still there. There was no enough groundwork for them. The other one we said was like a response for the media warfare and the nature of the new media warfare after El Comandante Chavez died in March the 5th in 2013. It was something that actually started immediately. So it was like adapting to new times and also going back to the basics and some other stuff because we were pretty much in a highly ideological Comandante Chavez filter media environment. We had like this major teacher that suddenly wasn't there anymore. And there was like this sort of vacuum that not only us, but I mean, the whole media landscape had to adapt to it. Not only Chavismo, landscape, maybe media landscape or environment, but also the opposition. So that's where Misión Verdad came from. It has been like a long, sometimes tough process, and now we are like in a very stable moment with new people, younger people also that learn from our methods and are now running things. And we're also, this is a part of an advertisement. We also have, based on this kind of work, we have also launched back in the end of October the Samuel Robinson Institute for Original Thinking, which is it's more like a global South think tank. It doesn't have the same rhythms or demands that Misión Verdad has. It's tried to go deeper and build different interfaces and links, which is something that's pretty new, and we're still at it right now. But it's part of the same drive, the same initiative, and I think the same need that us as writers, researchers, thinkers have for one side, and also the audience on the other one, especially on such a fastly changing psyop info warfare we're in a global scale. Not only Venezuela, but Venezuela has a very important place in all this for several reasons. Not only because of the controversies we might say that the Bolivarian Revolution means by itself, throughout all these years, but also because it's one of the hotspots, maybe one of the focus on the battle, the battle resisting empire. Not only Venezuela, but Venezuela as one of them, also very interconnected with other battlefields. Let's call it that way, globally. that could be pretty different on some aspects, but basically because of empire, there's a stronger unity of destiny, and also because of the new proposals of an emerging world. But that's basically it. I mean, and it's we work daily. It's like a daily analysis thing, and we also build special reports. I'm talking about Misión Verdad. Samuel Robinson Institute also has a daily report service in Spanish. We're still building the English section right there, but it will come out soon.
Yeah. So thanks for filling everyone in on that. I would highly recommend going to check out. I had up missionverdad.com, and again, there's English language reporting, and then also the Samuel Robinson Institute. It's incredible because anyone who watches or listens to Moderate Rebels knows that Max and I always make fun of think tanks, which everyone knows that these Washington think tanks they're funded by governments, the arms industry, the fossil fuel industry, and they serve those oligarch interests, and they always push wars and regime change operations. So it's so rare when we have a think tank, which for me is just such a tarnished word. Like when I think of think tank, I just think of like these people wearing lanyards who like never leave their air-conditioned office while they advocate for like bombing the entire planet, and they're all chicken hawks. And I mean, they're like also just like nerds, but it's like revenge of the nerds in a bad way. Like they were made fun of in high school, and they want to get their revenge by like bombing the entire planet. So it's so rare that we have a think tank that's actually good, that's anti-imperialist, that's progressive. So I would highly recommend checking out the Samuel Robinson Institute. It's excellent.
I think that has, well, I have to add up a couple of things about that. I mean, the first thing is that you have very good, I mean, this is kind of, I think it's awkward to say, but think tanks, and I mean, mainstream 400 and 500, eternal warfare funded think tanks also show some pretty neutral, in a way, useful tools that you can expropriate and use it in a different way and in our terms. So not only dispossession the other way around, we can also build on some similar structures and produce it. That's one thing. And the other thing is, I think it's also a part of a bigger trend. I think these kind of experiments is something that's also going on in several other places. I mean, I could think about, for example, I don't know if it's exactly a think tank, but it relates to it, like the Tricontinental VJ's project, for example, and so on. So I think it also has to, because there is like a demand of how to shape thinking and how to also link this thinking, this thought that's being created in resistance, in actual factual and skin in the game resistance to empire. So I think it also a base to that drive, Are you there? I think I lost you. Have problems with connection. You there, Ben? Well, it says here everyone can see me, but I can't see anyone, especially you, man. So I'm gonna leave and head back here.
Hey, it looks like we're having some technical issues here. So I'm here, and I'm gonna get Diego back. So sorry about the. So just while I'm getting Diego back, I just want to fill in that Diego is a journalist in Venezuela, in Caracas, and I'm here in Nicaragua, and in both countries sometimes the internet is not super strong. So sorry, we lost we lost each other there, Diego. I don't know what you were talking about when we lost our signal.
Yeah, no problem, man. Well, I was talking about, yeah, and also the IT issue in this part of the world. But I was talking about that also the think tank thing. First of all, it notwithstanding being Fortune 500 eternal warfare industry funded think tanks filled with, well, with those dangerous, senseless geeks you were talking about earlier, it also offers, if you are able to expropriate, some pretty cool tools that you can use the other way around, you know? And the other thing is that there's like this demand on creating this thought thinking centers, this centers of thought of studies. I think we're not the only ones actually trying to do this from the global south in this way, as in trying to bring a balance between local and global, and also between languages and concepts. I think we have, for example, the Tricontinental. I don't know if it's called properly a think tank, but it's pretty close to what we do with their own specific elements, you know.
Yeah, well, I really appreciate what you all are doing, and like I said, I mean, considering in the U.S. that pretty much every think tank is run by like these mouth foaming neocons who just like
Chicken
who
hawks.
they get no pleasure in human interaction in life, and get no pleasure in interpersonal relations. They only get pleasure in just like advocating for more war. I mean, just like the most utter sociopathic people I can think of. But
Yeah, the human contact part kind of resembles what the Great Reset is about, and who's thinking about that kind of things, but also crazy things.
yeah, well, I mean, we should talk about that. I mean, there's so many
Yeah.
issues to address. I mean, the thing about Diego, for people who don't know him, is that he's just a wealth of knowledge, a fountain of knowledge, as the cliche goes. I mean, he could talk about any issue. It would be interesting to talk
Thanks, man.
about the Great Reset and this moment we're living in, because it's not only relevant for really the entire world, but especially for countries like Venezuela, and how I mean, there's the Great Reset, which is the kind of neoliberal Great Reset where we're being told that we're gonna own nothing and be happy, like this kind of neo-feudal technocracy. But then there's also countries that are doing their own kind of political revolutionary Great Reset. And you see Venezuela, which now it has built closer relations with Iran, and there's this attempt to build a new axis. So, I mean, there's a lot to talk about there, but I'll do more a proper introduction here.
Yeah,
So
cool.
today we're going to talk about a few things. Someone pointed out in the chat here that I didn't know that Jimmy Dore has a stream at the same time. No, which means we're really screwed in terms of numbers, but it's cool. I mean, the advantage of this is that we're trying to build. I mean, we have the Gray Zone channel. We're also trying to build the Moderate Rebels channel, and thinking of doing some more streams here that are kind of more kind of personal and like, casual. Whereas at the Gray Zone, it's often like there's like 5 people, and so we're always I mean, this is gonna be more just like a conversation with a good friend of mine, Diego, who's just a brilliant journalist.
That's it.
So and then I want to use this as an opportunity to take people's questions. So I'm gonna say that anyone who's a patron at patreon.com/moderaterebels, we have some questions there that I'm going to get to in a bit. So if anyone also wants to ask, of course, you can ask questions here in the chat on YouTube or Twitch, and I'm going to try to address them. And we're going to, because this is an opportunity to pick the brain of a journalist who's Venezuelan. He lives in Caracas. He can dispel a lot of the myths and rumors about Venezuela. Another thing we're going to talk, which doesn't get really any attention in mainstream U.S. corporate media, is the situation in Colombia. So last year, there was a record for massacres. We're talking that every year in Colombia, there are hundreds of activists, human rights activists, labor organizers, agricultural workers, campesino organizers, indigenous people, Afro-descendant Colombians who are massacred. We're talking about hundreds of massacres per year. And that's also related to a scandal that just came out recently in the media about what's called the false positives. And we now know, according to this new court that reached a ruling in this kind of independent court, that more than 6,400 people were executed by the Colombian military, and then they were falsely labeled socialist guerrillas. So from either the FARC, the Revolutionary Socialist Group, and the ELN. And so we're going to talk about those, and also because Colombia, being the neighbor of Venezuela, Diego is doomed to sharing, like, having one of the worst neighbors. It's like having one of those neighbors that like plays really loud music at like 4 a.m. But it's also like really bad music. Cause like I can tolerate neighbors who play like okay music, but it's like they're like blasting like Miley Cyrus at 4 a.m. and you just want to commit suicide. So I mean that's like the geopolitical equivalent, as Hugo Chavez famously said, Colombia is the Israel of Latin America. So, and then we're going to talk about the new Cold War, which is always something that, at the Gray Zone and Moderate Rebels that we're discussing. So anyway, there's a lot I just laid out there, Diego, but that's kind of going to be a map that we're going to try to follow here in this conversation. But I just want to start, if you can just talk about what the situation's like there in Caracas. My colleague Max and also my colleague Anya Parampol, they were there, they visited with you. We did another stream at the Gray Zone talking about the situation with the election of the National Assembly in December.
Yeah, that's correct.
And so anyone who's interested in that can listen to the interview we did at the Gray Zone. But let's talk about what's been happening since we now have Joe Biden is in, and he has continued the sanctions. There's no sign of sanctions relief. And also, Antony Blinken, the very hawkish Secretary of State, says he still recognizes Juan Guaido as the interim president of Venezuela, even though they even lost the fig leaf of fake legitimacy that this coup puppet had, which is that he was the leader of the National Assembly. He no longer is even in the National Assembly. So, I mean, what's going on right now?
Well, that's we're seeing how things are partially as we expected. I mean, personally, but we're seeing how things are settling now in let's call it a post-Trump relationship between the U.S. and Venezuela. And yes, we've got several things are moving, and I don't think we even have some different signs from the Trump cycle that also have to be like minded here, because yes, I mean, for one, it seems kind of hard that you address the Guaido. I mean, I wasn't sure what was going to happen. Actually, I was expecting some last crazy move by Pompeo before he leaves instead of this, but maybe they already knew that this was going to happen. Venezuela, clearly now it's already confirmed one more time. It's a bipartisan issue. It's not a discussion between Republicans or Democrats, because actually if we follow the links that build up especially for the legal de jure part of the hybrid warfare against Venezuela, it starts with the Democrats. Actually, it's not even the Democrats. It's a bipartisan act that was introduced in December 2014 about the classic human rights and accountability kind of law that was actually sponsored by people that from Bob Melendez to Marco Rubio. That's actually the first step. And the next step, it's the Obama executive order of March the 8th, 2015, which is called the Obama Decree. That actually states, I think it's a template, but still it's pretty funny that in a mean way that it states that Venezuela is an unexpected and an unusual threat, an unusual and extraordinary threat to the U.S. security. So, and it was based on this groundwork that actually the Trump administration actually advanced the whole agenda. I mean, the new, it started like it always starts with sanctions, having high senior officials for some reasons. We can talk about it, in a bit. But you have also, after 2017, which was a very complex and very violent year here in Venezuela, you got that the Trump administration started to actually officially sanctioning the oil industry and also blocking in several other ways the Venezuelan economy in a way that it became an even worse news, a chokehold for the Venezuelan people, the Venezuelan economy, the Venezuelan country, and Venezuela's relationship, financial and commercial relationship with the world. and you also got the Guaido experience that happened during the Bolton years in the National Security Council. And so thinking of a new Blinken State Department, like rolling back on all this process, it was kind of hard to imagine, because it was going to, at some point, it was going to aim directly to the source and the origins of this and where it started and who are the politically responsible. And what that would say about their real interest in Venezuela, which is not only resources in the biggest lands, coastline in the Caribbean basin. It's also to discipline the people, to discipline a government and a political project and experience that showed an alternative to do things differently. So there was no surprise there. Of course, you already said it. It makes even more thinly veiled the legitimacy and also the strength that Guaido and their part of I don't know if it's an opposition anymore. I mean, it's just like overt proxies. And but you also have different signs and on several aspects about sanctions. And I don't know how to take this now, how to finally think about this yet. We have to see. But we have like this report by the Office of Accountability, the Federal Office of Accountability, that gave it to Congress, talking about the harm that the U.S. sanctions are doing against the Venezuelan economy. And it was actually, I know it's protocol, but it's still meaningful that it was welcomed by the Congress Foreign Relations Committee by the Congressman Gregory Meeks, which is someone that actually knows Venezuela quite well. So I'm not saying this is hopeful, but at least at some point it's a different message. And we can also add up to this, at least for a moment, what the comings and goings of the EU, notwithstanding that at this moment, as you well know, they, in a very unexpected way, at least from what were actually things developing between Venezuela and some European countries, this was strongly promoted, I think, by the Germans. But
Diego, let's talk about that really quickly for people who don't know. We just saw this in the past few days that President Nicolas Maduro announced that they were expelling the EU representative in Venezuela. And of course, the EU has very aggressive sanctions against Venezuela. But this was also an interesting move, not only on the part of Venezuela, but on the part of the EU, expanding these aggressive postures, because the EU recently announced that it no longer recognized Juan Guaido.
Yeah, I think that has to do in some way or another, and in some inner struggle between that labyrinthical logics and rationale that's behind the EU and the Orwellian part of it also. But you have
you mean like the fight between Germany and France, which are like trying to vie for control.
Exactly, because this was strongly promoted by them in a way, but also Spain's role, but also the U.S. pressure on this. It's like a very mixed situation. Then that has like these developments, and actually, I mean, it's hard not to see how they are actually more harmful to the EU. What's the most important take of this? Well, there's two of them. First of all, they also sanctioned several opposition Venezuelan politicians that are part of the new National Assembly, the re-elected National Assembly, because the previous National Assembly, which was the one that was headed by Guaido in 2019, its legal period expired. So there was new elections, and it was recovered mostly by the Chavista majority, but it also has a significant number of opposition MPs that are actually against. They're trying to build their own place in the world, and they are against sanctions. They're against foreign aggression and foreign meddling, and therefore solutions. It doesn't mean they are Chavistas or they agree with Chavismo, but they are with solutions between a national framework. So this is very important, because actually the response of Venezuela to these sanctions was to declare persona non grata to the EU representative here. And this was demanded by the National Assembly. This was nothing from the executive branch of government or the judiciary or the other two, because remember that Venezuela has 5 government branches. It also has the Moral Council, which has to do with accountability, and it also has the electoral body, so which is a state power by itself. But
but of
this
course,
is a very
if you
important.
listen to Western media, Venezuela is controlled by one man, Nicolas Maduro, and there's no other institutional force. I mean, that's the caricature that we're portrayed
Yeah.
at. But what you're saying is super important. That in Venezuela, and I've seen this with my own eyes, that there very much is a kind of internal political struggle, not only between the opposition and Chavistas, and even within the opposition, but also within the state. And it's not actually, it's much more. There's much more kind of internal dynamics and moving parts than a lot of people think.
Yeah, it's a much more complex political process. It's a very live and dynamic process, and actually it's very crazy because we're like from very, and this is a 20 years situation, Ben. We go through several and constant and intense news cycle, one after the other one in a very short time span. So it's sometimes, if you're not let's call it a quote unquote a Venezuelan hand, it's not easy to catch up with the situation. And you can see the effort of the mainstream media to like try to simplify and try to normalize this way of the political process, which is not actually. It's pretty biased, there's no surprise on this, but I mean, it's good to remember people that it's a very dynamic process. It's not it's not only on one direction. There's a major debate inside Chavismo. There's a major debate, yes, in between Chavismo and some left positions. There's also very sour debate between opposition positions and factions and trends that are also there. So it's like any other country, but of course they will try to frame it like a very basic binary kind of dynamic, which is not. So same with, you can say the same exact thing in their own specifics about Iran, about Syria, I mean, about Cuba properly, Nicaragua, but it also has like this, and there's another clear part, which is this pro-take artificial subordinated body that's like based on the U.S. proxies. I mean, between parties, politicians, civil society, media, and so on, that are basically on the U.S. and UK and EU payroll in general, and would actually just advance regime change talking points and so on. So that's very important, not only because of I would say, in this complex context, the health of the political process and regardless of how much sanctions and aggressions have hurt the Venezuelan society, it has been a struggle about finding ways to just go beyond and overcome these difficulties and keep normalcy, the battle for normalcy going on. And this is something that happens on the political process, but also happens in society itself. And so if you focus on that part of our history and in this moment, there's a lot of complaining. I think that relates to a couple of things. First of all, it's normal because we've gone through so much, and it's very normal to have like this. Sometimes that kind of things going on, but that doesn't mean that when things get tough against Venezuela in terms like, for example, the Guaido adventure, when it started, you can see that a lot of people, including opposition or non-Chavistas, patriotic people, actually opposed the whole fake adventure, and you can understand what's going on. Anyway, it doesn't mean there hasn't been an impact of sanctions. Obviously, it has. I mean, we have very severe inflation problem. things are getting better also, by the way, in recent years. I mean, it's different than it was like in 2015, 2016, and 2017. Notwithstanding having even smaller revenues from oil or any other sort of income, but this has also taken the Venezuelan country as a whole, like, into rethink itself, in several ways, and go through several lessons that, I mean, they're huge, because we're talking about major geopolitical operations here that have a very strong impact in population, but it also delivers all these lessons. And I think the best way to measure this, it's actually the response to COVID. And especially if you contrast it and you compare it to other countries like Colombia, I mean, all these U.S. darlings, I mean, Peru, Colombia, Chile. I mean, they all have like the best mainstream media coverage and so on, but at the same time, the worst humanitarian situations in the hemisphere after the U.S. and after Brazil.
And after Brazil, exactly. Well, I want to talk about that, but just while we're on the subject of Venezuela developing new tactics to get around the blockade, you mentioned that the situation, especially economically, was much more difficult a few years ago, and it's still difficult, but it's gotten less difficult. Well, on Patreon, for anyone who's interested, you can go to patreon.com/moderaterebels. I have a really good question here from Mike R, and I just want to read it. Mm-hmm. And he was asking about the actions Venezuela is taking to resist U.S. economic sanctions. For instance, he said, I've read that Venezuela is developing a cryptocurrency, and that's called the Petro, so you can talk about that in a second. He said that he read that Venezuela is also trying to work with bartering schemes. And he said, can you also talk about the anti-blockade laws? So this is a really good question. I mean, really the question is about,
yeah, absolutely.
Can you talk about these different tactics that Venezuela has been using to get around the U.S. blockade? So cryptocurrency is one, bartering, and the anti-blockade law. And then I would also add its relations with Iran and other countries.
Yeah, sure. I mean, this situation, it's not that it has done what I think the U.S. expected, as in bringing over Venezuelan society and government to collapse or something else. It actually has, in a very tough way, but it has like forced us to rethink a lot of things, especially thinking on the economy aspect. I mean, we were like doomed by the abundance of having a major commodity, still having it, but of course being one of the major chokeholds, which is oil, in the oil market and the energy market and so on. That was Venezuela's nature. I mean, you only had the oil state company as a creator of wealth, and now all this is a discussion that has been that's been happening before sanctions, of course, and even before Presidente Nicolás Maduro. It comes from the Chavez era also, but it's a discussion how to diversify and try to create a new economy, a new dynamic of production, and so on. And this has been more like
Diego, sorry to cut you off really quickly, but in Venezuela, some people refer to that idea as the Estado Mágico, the magic state. I believe it's Fernando Coronil wrote this book. And the point is that for 100 years, the developmental philosophy of at least the non-extreme neoliberal forces, like the ones before Chavismo who were more nationalist, the idea was it's the Estado Mágico. We can develop our country basically through magic because of oil that comes from the ground, not through production. And that's not new. That goes back way before Chavismo.
Yeah, I mean, the oil process, the oilization of Venezuela started early in the 20th century. It got a major boost with the dictatorship of Juan Vicente Gomez in the 1920s and 1930s, and it strongly developed. It's classic of not underdevelopment, anti-development. That's what we had, which is like this very comprehensive development of only one branch of industry, which is the one that actually interests to foreign capital, especially the U.S. sphere, which is oil in this case. So that actually created this situation, which is like also due to distribution of work in nations. And it's not only a Venezuelan thing. You can think, I mean, also, by the way, Coronel also talks about it, and this is a very accurate association. I mean, he says it kind of relates to what the nature of state, in a way, in this way, especially in the economic and wealth creation way of Nigeria. Politically, something different, of course, but they're pretty much alike in that sense, as in having one exclusive source of revenue, but also several others that haven't been developed enough. We also had a very strong basic industries, which is another story, especially with iron.
Wouldn't Libya be another example?
Not exactly, but yeah. But Libya, it's even more different because actually Libya got to develop in a different way. They saw a way. I mean, you think, for example, with Gaddafi's this major watering project they built. It was like the biggest, the biggest aqueduct system in the world. I forgot the one-man project was called, which was actually, well, it was not only for for the cities, but also for agriculture. That's a good example of different things and strategies that Libya had. And I think Libya played it differently, and Libya had a different thing also relating to Venezuela, and especially to Nigeria, which is population. I mean, how a very small population in comparison to first Venezuela, but then, of course, especially Nigeria being the most populated country in Africa. So the thing is that this is a model that everyone knew it was already exhausted. It was dried up because you need to develop other forces, other productive forces, and you have to have also a different philosophy and mentality on development and the needs of Venezuela, and also the weaknesses, because also these are the weaknesses that the U.S. has taken advantage of to make us suffer a bit more. And I'm talking about food sovereignty, I'm talking about reliance on imports, and so on. And because because for several reasons, first, before Chavismo, there was not an actual real interest in developing in the other forces, and during Chavismo, you had a mixed situation when you got this several trial and error situation in peace first, that didn't matter too much if they didn't work or not because you have the major revenue, but you also have in a war period like this, which is actually a life or death situation. So it's pretty different. But that also brings another element to the Venezuelan national conversation about the nature of economy and productivity, and the need also to organize communities, workforce, and so on with this aims. But this was also a process that naturally is going to be also sabotaged, disrupted by the whole sanction warfare, the whole irregular warfare we've been going through, of course. And because these kind of processes, as you well know, are actually, that's what they aim for. They aim to cripple development, welfare, and so on. And partially they succeeded, but I mean, they just don't understand other elements of the Venezuelan spirit and mind and consciousness and historical awareness. And that's where they always fail. I mean, you can see what happened with, let's take Guaidó, for example, where Guaidó was actually a miscalculation. I mean, they really thought, and they duped Trump about being able to just declare him, and 2 weeks afterwards, the whole Venezuelan Bolivarian project was going to be crumbling, and it didn't happen. The same thing happened in the April 30, 2019 coup attempt, which was actually the CIA and other agencies being absolutely duped, basic lies by the
Diego,
Venezuelan government.
I think it was 26 soldiers actually rose up in that coup attempt in Venezuela.
No, it was bigger than that. It was quite bigger. But the thing is that what allowed it to go that far is because all these U.S. spooks and so on were actually convinced that they were actually talking to the high officials of the government that were saying, yes, we're in this, we're involved in this, and that was not true, and they simply just played a simple card that duped one more time, U.S. officials like Bolton and Pompeo and so on, but also the CIA. I mean, and also the regional governments that were part of this,
Well,
and
Diego,
actually,
I want to ask you more about Operation Gideon, but before that, and the role of Colombia and the Operation Gideon is the failed U.S.-backed invasion. But before we get to that, just really quickly, because I just want to get really, because it's a good conversation and we sometimes go in different directions. But I want to get back to this question
pretty
of,
easily.
can you explain really quickly what Petro is, the cryptocurrency in
Yeah,
Venezuela, and then what is
I want to. Yeah, go ahead. I mean, we have to wrap up on that idea because we're not finishing answering that question, which is true. But I mean, those are two good examples. I mean, first of all, the Petro experiment, and then you have the anti-blockade law. I mean, these are two good examples. First of resilience in a way, as in trying to be creative against such adverse situations. And the Petro, which is a very important. Funny enough, I mean, they laughed a lot about the Petro, but I mean, a month after it was issued, created based, I mean, a cryptocurrency based on actual wealth with the oil. That's basically it, pegged to the oil price. To us to do some transactions and to go into the cryptosphere, to go to blockchain and keep on the economy alive in some way or another, and also in a way that's actually a step farther from the U.S. petrodollar system, which is actually, as we all know, it's a currency based on violence. And if it wasn't such a strong possibility of something, why did they actually issue an executive order banning the use of Petro? The U.S. did that. That was I think, if I'm not mistaken, somewhere around September, October 2018. That was one of the major executive orders issuing sanctions against Venezuela. It was banning the use of Petro. Also, they like the trade with oil, with gold. But I mean, if it was such a basic dumb thing, why did they actually have to issue an executive order preventing its function, its possibility? So it's still something that maybe also has advances and setbacks, and you need to develop this crypto culture a bit more to actually use it in a more effective way. But that's something that's there still. I mean, it's part of building way out of the dollar. Then you have the anti-blockade
Diego,
law.
A friend of ours, Ortiz, who's a
Mm-hmm.
communicator,
Yeah,
journalist
sure.
in Venezuela, she published a video people can find showing she went to different stores and showing and buying things with Petro. Like you can go to a store in Venezuela and you can use Petro as the currency. Like it's not just something that the government created. No, I mean, that's like some kind of marketing initiative. It's a real currency that you can use.
Yeah, I mean, if you go to, for example, some commercial district of Caracas, like Sabana Grande, you're going to see a lot of stores now. I mean, I'm talking about garment and shoes and, that kind of things. You're going to see that they announce now that they accept crypto, not only Petros, but also Bitcoin or Dash or some other cryptocurrencies, which is actually diversifying trade in a way. I mean, local trade. So that tells you something. Petro's still not as widespread use as it should be. I mean, being a crypto, but it's slowly getting there. I mean, this is one example of what I've said about the Sabana Grande area in Caracas, where now you can see all the stores that actually accept that. You can also pay gas now with the new gas system. You can also pay fuel for it.
Yeah,
if you go to a gas station.
I believe that China has also been helping with this because China has been pushing paperless purchases, like being able to, and it's something that I noticed in Venezuela, which is incredible considering in many parts of Latin America, a lot of people don't even have credit cards because they don't have bank accounts. So a lot of the economy is still all paper oriented. But I've noticed in my time in Venezuela that everywhere you go, because of inflation, one of the solutions people found is that everywhere you go, you can buy things with a card. So even if someone's on the street, like if someone's selling peanuts and eggs and bananas and plantains, you can buy those with a card and they'll swipe it on their phone. So we've seen a move toward like this kind of paperless economic transactions as a way of getting around the inflation.
Yeah, I mean, it's not by choice. It just happened. I mean, we're not like enthusiasts about being a cashless society, like the Indian experiment that Modi tried a couple of years ago, which went pretty bad. But yeah, I mean, daily economy here, it's a very crazy thing now because, and sometimes it can be pretty annoying if to be honest, because sometimes, for example, now they also released the use of dollar. It's not dollarization like some people trying to say, but they just released the cash flow of foreign currencies, such as the dollar or also the euro, but mostly dollar, and dollar notes. I mean, especially. But you always have to find a way to combine dollars with your debit card to pay something. The part of the card using as in debit, of course, it has become a major alternative during the sanction years, but it also relates to a different policies back in the Chavez days to actually bankerize, financialize poor people, asking access to credits, to banking, to the bank account, and so on. That was a major effort, a major drive that was established. I think it started somewhere around 2004, 2005, and it's 7 different stages and more public banking and so on that actually laid the groundwork for this part, as in being like sort of a de facto, undeclared, and unwielding cashless society. Because yeah, because of a very complex mechanism that we can go through that anyway, another moment, that makes the bolivar, our national currency, sometimes even worth less than it does, makes the situation. But actually, this economic activity helps out a lot and relieves a lot of expensive things about cash. Cash is cash. I mean, printing cash, not in the Fed sense, but I mean physical bills, notes to pay. It's something that's also pretty expensive, and there's no point if it's going to be worthless soon enough. So this is our ways to adapt to this kind of things, and also in a very Venezuelan way, which is like working not in a very organized fashion for the foreign eye, but in a very dynamic and, I mean, high temperature way, And so the other thing that to wrap up the question from our friend, it's the anti-blockade
law.
Yeah, which is a very important piece of legislation because it was one of the final acts of the National Constituent Assembly, and it was the last sanction law they did before ending their functions. Now that we have an actual legislative body that came back to the national framework, So
really quickly, just to fill in for people who don't know, the National Assembly in 2015, the opposition won the National Assembly in a country that we're told in the U.S. is supposedly a dictatorship. The government allowed, because they respect election results, unlike in the U.S. where they actually don't respect election results. But the opposition won control of the National Assembly.
That's right.
In 2015, but what happened is that there was a region in contempt of court, refusing to abide by Supreme Court orders, and there was this kind of conflict in the National Assembly that made it basically, it was a stalemate, and they couldn't get anything done. And what you're saying now is that finally, after 5 years, in December 2020, the National Assembly is being able to function again. So, like we were talking about earlier, Venezuela is very much not a dictatorship. I mean, there's so many moving parts inside the country and in terms of the government, and there's 5 branches of government. So what you're saying is now it's a little more streamlined and it's a little easier to be able to implement legislation.
Yeah, and you have a lively debate now. I mean, the opposition MPs are not people that actually just, don't say anything. They actually do, and they talk a lot, and they oppose a lot of things, and they also propose, which is something that's incredibly necessary to have a real proposing national opposition. And by the way, I think it was today or yesterday, Javier Bertucci, which is also a new MP from the Evangelical Party here, was actually banned from, because he was sanctioned, of course. But I thought I think he thought that sanctions didn't actually reach him. He was his entry was to the U.S. was banned. He went to Miami and had to, and the U.S. government didn't allow him, so he had to come back. That happened yesterday, if I'm not mistaken. Just to let you know that the sanctions are not only for Chavista officials. I mean, we're talking about an opposition. We're talking about a guy that actually leads an evangelical party, that also makes part of the National Assembly right now, which is pretty funny.
I mean, the U.S. goal was clearly to prevent the National Assembly from being a functioning institution because, as you just acknowledged, the Trump administration, and this has continued under Biden, the U.S. government was sanctioning non-Chavista Venezuelan opposition officials who are members of the National Assembly because the U.S. forced the extreme opposition forces to boycott the election. So the only conclusion you can take from that is that Washington does not want the National Assembly to be a functioning institution.
No, of course not. I mean, because it goes against the whole narrative. It goes against the whole story. I mean, it goes against the meaning and the existence of non-entity Guaidó, for example. I mean, if there's no National Assembly under contempt like the one in the past, there's no Guaidó. There's no actual place you can. I mean, it's not Ahmed Chalabi, and it's not the Libyan Transitional Council. They weren't even able to do that. They weren't able to advance that up to that point. They tried. They're still trying, but it has less and less strength. Definitely. I mean, and that's something I can say for a fact. That doesn't mean they're not going to keep harming us and trying to steal and keep on robbing our resources and being them the in-between in that criminal operation that's going on there. Because we're talking about dispossession, expoliation. We're talking about land grabbing and stealing. We're talking about larceny here. It's not politics. And it's not even a sophisticated scheme. I mean, it's a pretty basic heist with intermediaries. That's the whole thing. So, and because of sanctions, yeah, exactly. Because of sanctions, and a lot of Venezuelan national entities of Venezuela are not able to actually trade. They're not able to actually exchange anything, have a normal relationship with the rest of the commercial relationship with the rest of the world, because a lot of these foreign capitals or people interested in investing in Venezuela or anything, or buying Venezuelan flowers, whatever, man, are not able to actually trade because you're going to get financial, strong, long-arm jurisdiction pressure and so on not to do it, to refrain themselves to do it and prevent Venezuela to have a normal foreign trade dynamic and economics. And so you not only have like this public entities that are not able to do to work in that sphere. So you have to create a way that other legal figures are able to actually do this trade and be part of this. What's the word? I mean, this system of production and selling and trade, which must rely a lot on the private initiative, not neoliberal private initiative by itself. It has also several dimensions of property, of associations to do this and to build other ways to keep production for exports, for example, and to keep trade going, and to keep it, and try to find ways for this revenue to come back and come to the country. So this is what it's all about. I mean, and you need some political stability to achieve this, and that's what's so important about how the National Assembly now. It's one more time a legal, law-abiding body of the Venezuelan system.
Yeah, and Diego, you hit a key point, and this is a point that I stress a lot to people they don't necessarily think about. The U.S. blockade, and when I say blockade, we're talking about these aren't just sanctions. It's a full-on economic embargo, a Cuba-style blockade. In fact, the
Exactly.
U.S. also has naval forces that are enforcing a de facto naval blockade. So we're talking about a blockade. It's a medieval-style blockade of the country, and
Yeah,
like
it's coercive unilateral measures. That's actually the parlance of our foreign ministry, and I think it's correct to call it that way because sanctions, like Foreign Minister Zarif said, implies justice, and there's no justice
yeah,
here.
the United Nations officially refers to them as unilateral coercive measures. And at the Gray Zone,
Exactly.
my colleagues Aaron Mate and Anya Parampil, have interviewed the UN top expert, the special rapporteur on sanctions, unilateral coercive measures. Elena Dohen is her name. She's Belarusian,
That was
professor
another
of human
detail
rights
we
law.
needed to review of these novelties, because that's another step in acknowledging the criminality of these pressure measures.
Yeah, so for people who
And
don't
that's I
know,
think it's very
the,
important.
this UN top expert just took a trip to Venezuela, and she released a preliminary report saying that the US and EU sanctions have absolutely crippled the Venezuelan economy, caused extreme harm to the Venezuelan people. And this is the top UN official on unilateral coercive measures or sanctions. So that's very significant. But anyway, the point I was going to say is that the thing about the blockade is that it's not just aimed at regime change. Of course, that's the ultimate goal, the cherry on top. But at the same time, a point I often stress, as you just acknowledged, Diego, the blockade is also about forcing the government, well, first of all, preventing it from being able to govern, which is part of the regime change strategy. So they want to cause chaos and instability, which will, the idea is supposedly lead the people to overthrow their government. As it, like they'll storm the Bastille, like they'll storm Miraflores or whatever. I mean, that's like the ridiculous neocon. That's their wet dream, right? But that's not going to happen. I mean, but what it also but there's a list of priorities, right? Regime change is the cherry on top, but if they can't accomplish that, they can force the government to privatize state-controlled industries in order to be able to do business, because the U.S. government says that not only can't the Venezuela do business, but no other government or no other private company in the world can do business with PDVSA, the state oil company of Venezuela, or they're going to risk secondary sanctions. So the only way for Venezuela to get around that, especially when the U.S. controls the international financial system, and you talk about SWIFT, the economic, literally the way that banks, they actually, the way that they process financial payments, because it's all digital, it's controlled by the U.S. So the only way that Venezuela can get around that is basically by partially privatizing the oil industry. And so basically not only is the U.S.
Exactly.
blockading the economy, but they're forcing at gunpoint Venezuela to partially privatize state industries. That's one of the intended impacts.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, and you also have, and you also have the stealing part, the basic stealing part. It's the stealing of assets and so on that they try to do, and that's also part of the embargo. That's also part of the strategy, because it's a racket. War is a racket. Remember that. I mean, that's Smedley
Smedley Butler.
Butler's
Yeah,
word, whatever.
here in
Yeah, that's
Nicaragua,
Butler. That's it.
this week in Nicaragua, El Comandante, the President Daniel Ortega, gave a speech marking the anniversary of the U.S.-backed assassination of the revolutionary anti-imperialist leader Augusto Sandino. And in his speech,
Sandino.
Ortega said, the U.S., he said, where are the terrorists and where are the barbarians? They're in Washington. And then he said, they're gangsters. They're more gangsters than Al Capone.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, they're even more gangster than, I don't know, the Cartel de Jalisco Nuevas Generaciones. I mean, they're more gangster than this. They're the top gangsters. They're the top cartel. I mean, that's one thing about Trump. You can say anything about him, about his politics and whatever, and his personality or whatever, but at least Trump broke the omertà, the establishment omertà. That was his major sin, the biggest sin in the Trump cycle. He actually exposed how Mel Brookish, South Park style U.S. foreign policy actually is. And it's not that sophisticated canon, not even the James Baker level kind of things, that at least you have like forms.
Oh, looks like we lost Diego there, but in the meantime, I'm going to try to get Diego back. Like I said, sometimes unfortunately in Venezuela the internet is kind of weak, but one of the other things that we're going to pivot to here in a second is I want to talk about the situation in Venezuela because as I mentioned, there was a new report that came out in Colombia, the neighbor of Venezuela. There was a new report that came out that showed that 6,400 people have been killed by the Colombian military, and then that was actually falsely blamed on socialist guerrillas. Diego's back here, so this is a good pivot. We're going to talk
Yeah,
about.
I'm back.
Sorry that we lost you, Diego. I was
Cool.
explaining that the internet's a little weak sometimes in Venezuela because of the
It's
blockade,
awful.
but this is a good segue because while you were gone, I was doing a segue to talk about Colombia because we're an hour in. I don't want to keep you too long, so we'll pivot now to something very related to Venezuela. And I think the best way to pivot, we were talking about how U.S. imperialism is so gangster-like. I mean, this idea that the Democrats have that supposedly, it's progressive and there's diplomacy and you talk. No. The reality is that it's often that Washington, the U.S. Embassy, the State Department just blackmails these countries. And another country where we see that kind of gangster-like behavior is Colombia. Let's pivot here and talk about Operation Gideon. Last year was the failed comical invasion. I mean, it's comical because it was so bad, and people call it the Bay of Piglets. But if it wasn't so bad, I mean, it wouldn't be so funny. I mean, they were planning on killing Venezuelans, invading the country, and ultimately trying to kidnap or assassinate the president Maduro. And we now know because there was a recent story that got no coverage in the U.S. media. I wrote about it at the Gray Zone of a Colombian who was deeply involved in the operation. Yaxi was her name, and she said that she admitted she's now actually in a prison in Colombia, and she admitted that the Colombian intelligence agencies were totally involved at every level in supporting this attempted invasion. And also, of course, that the president, Ivan Duque, and also his political mentor, Alvaro Uribe, these are like the mafia leaders of Colombia, the right-wing cartel-linked leaders. They were involved in this operation, of course. And then, of course, she said that the U.S. government, the FBI, and the DEA were all involved in this operation. So on the Venezuelan side, what have we learned about this attempted invasion, and especially when it comes to the involvement of the U.S. and Colombian governments?
Yeah, so well, the first thing, the most general one of these, it's a very symptomatic way of analyzing the current state of empire. If you think a bit about the Gideon experience and the way a private enterprise, a military private enterprise, pretended to create this military operation that was going to deliver regime change in Venezuela, actually was basic, plain and classic filibusterism, U.S. antebellum filibusterism, as in William Walker, as in Narciso Lopez, and so on.
Yeah, really quickly, William Walker,
so that tells
for people
you,
who don't know, William Walker was a U.S. mercenary who basically just invaded Nicaragua and created a mercenary army and then declared himself president. So when you say filibusterism, it's not like the filibuster in the U.S. Congress. We're talking about like basically a kind of colonialism.
Yeah, I mean the original word, exactly. Yeah, we're talking about the original word, not another one in Congress or Senate. Yeah, it has nothing to do with that. It has to do with the actual original meaning of filibustering, as in piracy, as in classic piracy, and sponsored by big concentrated capitals. Because in the case of William Walker, it was the Vanderbilt oligarchy first, the Vanderbilt oligarch, and then in other groups, and then he went crazy and so on. But and it's not much of a big difference there either, because it is also, at the end of the line, corporate sponsored in some way or another. Corporate, as in legal corporations, and illegal ventures or corporations such as drug trafficking. So the thing is, that from the Venezuelan side, you can see a lot of things. First, all the proofs about the Colombian government involved and how candidly all this broke, how did this happen, and also, if you take the word of, for example, our National Assembly president, even Colombian officials and sources actually are like tipping the Venezuelan government of these activities too. For example, the recent reunion between the virtual ambassador of Venezuela in Colombia, James Story, and that part of the Guaido opposition there, that was something that was actually leaked by the government, by the Colombian government. So it's a very even more complex situation there. The thing is, check this out, Ben, for example, the Venezuelan informal army that was actually based in La Guajira province in northern Colombia, next to the Venezuelan border, was actually sponsored and they got the collaboration of the Guajira cartel. They were talking drug trafficking here, a major drug cartel from Colombia. Because of two things. First, because one of these capos, one of these drug lords, actually financed the Duque campaign, the Ivan Duque campaign, what they call in Colombia the Ñeñe Política scandal, because it was Ñeñe Hernández. And the other part is that you have these people were actually hosted by another narco called La Silla, or Doble Rueda, double wheels, or La Silla, because he's on a wheelchair. This guy was extradition order to the U.S. yesterday, Ben. I mean, the guy that set up the logistics, the safe houses, and so on, and collaborating in so many ways with the mercenary Venezuelan Colombian army, and I was also related to Cliver Alcalá, which was the head of the crazy expedition, which is also now in the U.S. It was taken by the DEA. It's now going to be extradited to the U.S. right now, just like the former paramilitary commanders back in the day. So they're going to take a lot of U.S. state secrets there. And that's, I mean, you don't need another stronger confirmation of all this. I mean, and it's the link between the Colombian government, the Colombian state security, the DEA, the CIA, and of course the Venezuelan radical opposition, such as Juan Guaido, has been also pictured with some of these narco paramilitary leaders in the Venezuelan border. So it's so candid and so evident. So and
yeah, quick note
and
on
this
that.
is something that actually has been.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, Diego, you mentioned Ñeñe Hernández. This name, for people who don't know, this is a really big scandal right now in Colombian politics. Ñeñe Hernández, who died under very mysterious circumstances in Bolsonaro's Brazil. He was a very powerful Colombian drug lord, and he inherited a lot of land. He was a huge landowner and very rich, and it's now known that he used the drug money to buy votes for the far-right president Ivan Duque. So he basically helped Ivan Duque steal the election. He's really like he was a kind of political kingmaker in Colombia, and now there is an investigation going on over his links, although the fiscal, the chief prosecutor of Colombia, is a very close friend, longtime close friend of Duque, and has tried to push that under the rug. But then there's also another element you just mentioned, which is that there's this history of the U.S. allying with these drug dealing leaders and then basically just extraditing them when they outlive their usefulness. So another example is Tony Hernandez, the brother of Juan Orlando Hernandez, who's the current right-wing dictator of Honduras, who's stole the last election. Even the OAS acknowledged that. And his brother, Tony Hernandez, is sitting in a U.S. prison, and a U.S. federal court in New York, charged him and convicted Tony Hernandez, the brother of the Honduran president, for trafficking hundreds of tons, in fact, thousands of kilograms, not thousands of tons, thousands of kilograms of cocaine and machine guns into the United States. So, I mean, we're talking about the U.S. knew that and has continued supporting Juan Orlando Hernandez, even as it prosecutes his brother for dealing drugs. It's the same thing in Colombia. The U.S. is absolutely privy to this. They support it. And of course, we know that the CIA uses these kinds of operations to fund its black budget.
Yeah, I mean, it's because that's the actual policy. I mean, this is the actually dark alliance template policy that actually fuels lots of these regime change attempts, and especially from the logistical foot soldier part, not only because of funding, also because of expendable chips. And I'm talking about persons here, as in, and you have a huge number of workforce in that sense to actually find to recruit to do the bid of the state, in this case the Colombian state or the U.S. or both. And this is also a very descriptive, the whole Gideon operation is a very descriptive example of this. And and the other side of this, of course, is the disciplination
Diego,
and the predatory logics of state.
CIA, cocaine in action.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I mean, it's funny and it's sad and true at the same time. It's all things, because that's true. I mean, that's the proper acronym. And sometimes I
also like the CIA is capitalism's invisible army, but cocaine in action works too.
It's the same thing, actually. If you think about it, it's redundant in both cases, because there's no other, besides oil and energy, there's no other stronger force in the capitalist arteries than the cash flow from drugs. I mean, it actually bailed out. If we actually take with the Carla del Ponte's words, the anti-drug czar at that moment in the UN, it actually helped bail out Wall Street in 2008. Via laundering operations, HSBC and so on. And so I mean, that tells you a lot about.
Cocaine doesn't just keep all of like the sellers and like on the floor in Wall Street who are all like just sniffing cocaine all day to stay up 24 hours so they can short sell and like just barter, or not barter, just like gamble the entire economy. So like not only does Colombian cocaine figuratively keep Wall Street afloat by like powering all of those brokers, but also it literally economically kept Wall Street afloat.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and it's like this huge chunk of territory of lawless economy. And well, I think Charles Bowden is a wonderful read for this, and also how he called all these. For example, he called northern Mexico at that moment the globalization economy, the global economy killing fields. Colombia has the same status, in that sense. And not only you even have like the Mexican cartels operating directly now in Colombia. It's such a messy situation, but there's another side of this, because it also has to do, and of course it has to do with resources, but paramilitarismo and the paramilitary formations. Now they just try to call them criminal bands, but they're not. They have an adaptable, bigger structure. I'm talking about paramilitary formations here, and actually they do the bit not only for drug cash flow and drug flows and routes and so on, production and then distribution, but also agrarian counter reform, because also you have more, and that translated in two things: the resources under those agricultural lands and the campesinos that live on the top of them, but also to one more time discipline this, in this case, the Colombian people, el pueblo colombiano. And this is a historical constant. This is something that has always been there, and has always been, of course, the root of the problem. We're talking about land here and land dispossession. It has been the key and constant element in the Colombian conflict. Not only the Colombian conflict. I think if you can see that everywhere. But I mean, in Colombia, it's a pretty outspoken and clear situation. I mean, I think that's the case with most of the third world, but in the Colombian case, It's like the most extreme, constant version of this, and the most overt. And take, for example, I mean, during the 19th century, Ben, as you well know, after the independence cycle, the decolonization, the first independence cycles in Latin America, then came the formations of the new independent states that actually were shaped a lot with U.S. pressure and British economic expansion. You know, the mercantilismo, and and those are called the oligarchic republics. Most of them in Latin America went through a civil war experience after that. In the case of Venezuela, was extremely radical, and it even I mean blew up, eliminated part of the traditional oligarchy, not like it happened in Peru or happened in Colombia, which are more viceroyal historical developments. And modern states comes after that. And the thing is that this concept has never changed ever in the Colombian thing. So, but there's another element to this. Modern Colombia, you can say, started with this 1,000 Days War. Which it was like several armed conflicts that were the mix of provincial rights against the capital because of development of some of these cities that were starting to become powerhouses of sorts, and the conservative moment there, but also it was several conflicts that also has social justice demands there. The first ones in Colombia, in a modern sense, but you also had a third overlapping conflict here, which was the geopolitical one. And it goes around how it ended, how the 1,000 Days War ended. And it ended, the peace treaty, the definitive peace treaty, was signed in the USS Wisconsin in the shores of Panama. And that's when Panama becomes independent, because Panama was always part of Colombia. And in the Panamanian independence, by the way, was also the Panamanian drive of independence, and the artificial independence was actually sponsored especially by two figures, Teddy Roosevelt and J.P. Morgan. So you have this at the root of the early 20th century, ending or the late 19th century, as the base of this all, you know. And from that moment on, things went even southern with the Colombian agrarian situation. You have in 1936, you had the first shy attempt to do land reform, which was the La Ley 200, the 200 bill, which was by Adolfo López Pumarejo, who was a liberal governor that tried to attempt to do this. And this is where, like, also the counter-revolutionary and reactionary forces in Colombia, which are not the same thing, but they also, of course, they overlap themselves, respond to this land-demanding attempt. Then came 1948, but you have all, like in the regions, you have all these paramilitary structures like Pájaro and Chulavita that started to stem. Then you have the origins of La Violencia, which is the big period of violence that actually then spawned the contemporary guerrilla formations like the FARC and like el ELN, like el EPL, el M-19, el Comando Quintín Lame, and so on. It's a long story, but the thing is that I'm trying to say here is that land has always been the major issue. And it also was the major issue in the peace talks between the FARC and Colombia. And also the false positive scandal has to do with that, because all these 6,402 Colombian souls that were murdered and then disguised as guerrilleros so that the security forces can report more casualties in the battle against la guerrilla, we're all mostly campesinos also. Colombia has the biggest IDP population in the world, even more than Syria, contemporary Syria. So that tells you a lot, and that fact that always ends up being this tells you a lot about how the system, the Colombian system works, and how intertwined it's the lack of sovereignty mixed with the criminal class and the political class. Bear in mind something else, Ben. El Uribismo, it's not the oligarchy precisely. It would be like the Arabist aspirational capital. It was the neoliberal regional capitalist section of the Colombian society against the Colombian oligarchy. If this is, and this is pretty crazy, and this I think is going to pivot for something else, which is pretty important too. But in Venezuela, it was Chavez that got to power. In Colombia, it was Uribe. It was like the B side of the Venezuelan process. It was like the dark side of the Venezuelan revolution. It's that crazy and it's that simple. Of course, Uribe comes right after El Plan Colombia, and of course, he's the game changer in Colombian politics. He's the one that goes a step beyond and brings all the 80s experience in narco-violencia to a state level, because he was also part of the narco-violencia back in the 80s. He was, I mean, in his record, in his career, he started actually as a airport authority in the Antioquia department and actually waived a lot of crazy flights for the Medellin cartel. So
yeah, well, Diego, this is, yeah, I mean, what you just laid out there, there's a few points I want to pick at more because I think it's really revealing. First of all, there's a good comment here from Punkadelic. It's amazing how little is known among the Western left, how there's been a war waged against the Colombian left since the 1930s. Yeah, I mean, it's pretty wild. I mean, we're talking about one of the most brutal counterinsurgency campaigns in the entire world against the left in Colombia. It's, you know, I wouldn't use the term genocidal because it's not the definition of genocide, but you could say it's a kind of politicide. And there was a campaign that was actually tried against the Colombian state of politicide against the left for.
No, I think it's genocide, and I think politicide is part of genocide, you know? I think it has, because it's not only has been
Diego, do you want to talk about the conviction, the case against the Colombian state for politicide?
Sorry?
Yeah, do you want to talk about the case of politicide against the Colombian state in that history really quickly? Because it's not very well known.
Yeah, that's also pretty dramatic. Thank you. And of course, in this politicide that they were talking about, which is people's side. I mean, that's what I'm saying. Politicide. If you take the Palestinian experience, it's not. It's like it's genocide in the extent it's just not. It's forbidding a whole people to live, to actually live. Ben, it's necropolitics at its best. You know, and of course, there has always been incredibly amazing, virtuous initiatives of people self-organizing in all this history. And I mean, I'm being specific here about Colombia. I'm saying it's not only the 1930s, and we're talking about even before. We're talking about the Thousand-Day Wars one more time, and how the political class betrayed the grassroots of these processes also in the way. The most dramatic moment of this happened during La Violencia after El Bogotazo. El Bogotazo was the magnacide of the very charismatic and influential liberal leader, because the Partido Liberal, which was also mixed by the popular liberal leader of the Liberal Party, called Jorge Eliezer Gaitán. This is like the watershed moment.
Quick note to people, that was the assassination. It was an assassination, because in Spanish I say magnicidio, which is assassination. Just to translate.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, exactly. Thanks. No, good. I mean, it's important. And by the way, this was 3 days before the OAS was founded. There was actually, by the way, during El Bogotazo there, with the student protest movement, there was a young man from La Habana there also. There was a privileged witness of El Bogotazo. It was called Fidel Castro, who went with the student organization that was allied, by the way, with the Peronistas. And they were going to protest the U.S. presence there. And it's in this context, days before, yeah, and it's in this context, days before the actual official ceremony that launched the OAS, that Jorge Eliezer Gaitán is killed. It's during the fire and the bullets and and the assassination campaign that went afterwards, that the OAS was founded. It's founded in blood ever since it started, and it started with the whole birth of the national security state. 1948, Truman, you know? So the thing is that La Violencia, which actually was like the embryos of the war that will come after, that would develop afterwards, on very strong anti-communist lines, because this is also true to it, because this, if Gaetan was the popular liberal leader, on the other side, the conservative one was Laureano Gomez, which was from el Partido Conservador, which actually a real fascist. I mean, he was a Mussolini Hitler admirer. I mean, we're not being rhetorical here. We're talking about a real fan of European fascism and Nazism. It's not just being metaphorical about it, it's literal also. So this violence spread all across the country, especially on the land, and it became a massacre that was actually exerted by two structures, Los Pájaros y Los Chulavitas. These were the first conservative party paramilitary forces, paramilitary structures, parapolitical structures in the regions. That's like the serpent's egg right there. So in response to these massacres, the liberals, communists, and other forms of popular nationalism organized themselves for self-defense. From this generation, by the way, you have to add up something else. A lot of the military leaders of the first uprising, liberal uprising against the government, were war veterans from El Batallón Colombia. El Batallón Colombia was a small military contingent of Colombians that participated in the Korean War. These people, mostly from El Llano, from the plains in Colombia, which is basically the same culture in Venezuela, the Llanos. That's where Chavez comes from, by the way, in the Venezuelan side, of course. The first major rebellion in the 1950s was la rebelión de las guerrillas liberales del Llano, the liberal guerrillas from El Llano. You had wonderful, incredible leaders such as Guadalupe Salcedo y El Tuerto Giraldo. I mean, they were geniuses, and they were also very charismatic and wonderful, popular heroes. Well, they were able to settle some agreement. This is the first time in this wide cycle that the liberal guerrillas demobilized, being victorious. They were winning the war, but they nevertheless, because they were tired of the war, and then they promised a lot of things: political participation, land reform, and so, I mean, the same demands that currently are going on, and were part of the peace dialogues. So Guadalupe Salcedo, which was one of these motive. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, no, I just wanted to say, I mean, on that point, I mean, this history is so important, but I just don't want to get people too lost in the historical weeds.
It's too long. Yeah, I know.
No, but I mean, it's super important, but it's a very important historical parallel to what you're getting at, is that these are the same demands we're talking about today. And when I was talking about the use of the term politicide, I was referring to a case that a party in Colombia called the La Unión Patriótica, the Patriotic Union.
La Unión Patriótica, of course. Yes.
Yeah,
that was after, by the way, Ben, that was after another round of negotiations between.
Yeah, I don't know if we lost Diego again there. I think he froze. But while I'm waiting for Diego to come back,
are you there? I'm there. I lost you for a moment. I was saying the guerrillas were going to demobilize, and they were going to allow them political, civilian participation. And La Unión Patriótica actually was not only exterminated, it was very critical also of the leftist armed insurgencies.
Yeah, well,
and this politicized,
so,
actually, it's like
I just want to explain the historical
also the template for the current one.
Yeah, so the Patriotic Union was formed by forces. I think we're losing Diego, but yeah, we lost Diego again. You know, he's having internet issues. So while I'm waiting to get him back, I'm going to explain that the Patriotic Union was a party in Colombia founded in the 1980s, and it was a coalition, or rather, it was formed from people close to the FARC, the armed socialist group, and the Communist Party, and they supported a peace accord with the Colombian government to try to end the armed struggle. And what happened is, what Diego was getting at is essentially the government, the Colombian government, claimed to be interested in having a peace process, but actually ended up responding by just massacring, exterminating anyone involved in the peace process and exterminating the Patriotic Union as a political force, which represented the left. So what Diego was getting at, and he's back here now, what Diego was getting at is that we're seeing a very similar historical echo right now, where there was this historic peace breakthrough negotiated by the government of Juan Manuel Santos in Colombia, who was ironically also a conservative president, but not the kind of far right representative of like the national bourgeoisie forces and the drug forces that Ivan Duque represents. But so Juan Manuel Santos negotiated this historic peace breakthrough with the FARC, and since then, since Ivan Duque came back into power, the Colombian state has backed these paramilitary forces that have systematically exterminated former FARC guerrillas who laid down their weapons. They gave their weapons back to the Colombian state and demobilized, and since then hundreds have been massacred. So before we lost you, Diego, I think the point you were making is that what happened to the Patriotic Union, the politicide or the kind of political genocide against the left-wing forces of the Patriotic Union, is similar to what we're seeing now, where the Colombian state signed this peace agreement and then since then has violated all of its sides of the agreement and has continued to just murder left-wing leaders.
Well, you know something, Ben? It's with La Unión Patriótica, they wiped out a whole generation of wonderful leaders, not only from La Unión Patriótica, because you also had Carlos Pizarro León Gómez from the M19 movement. You also even have Luis Carlos Galán, which was from El Partido Liberal, but was a popular figure that was also murdered in the same context. In this case, by the Pablo Escobar, but it's the same thing. And I mean, you had leaders. So I mean, people should go and look for two things. First, to inform themselves of who Bernardo Jaramillo Osa was. I mean, that was an incredible leader that was brutally murdered. It was traumatic for the Colombian society. It's in Spanish. You probably could find an English subtitled version. It's called La Danza Roja. La Danza Roja, La Danza Roja, yes, which is a documentary that actually covers the experience of the La Unión Patriótica. It's pretty good. It's something, I think it was made somewhere around 2004, and most surely it's in YouTube. So I really recommend people to check that out to understand how the pattern, it's repeating itself, maybe even in more infamous and brutal terms, you know, because it's even more expansive, and it's even, well, and it goes not only that, it's not only public figures, mostly, there's a lot of community grassroots people that's being here exterminated for several reasons. And it's awful. I mean, it's frustrating after the achievement that this last peace process was, and how much strength and attention it had, you know? It was like the closing chapter of one of the unresolved Cold War situations in the region. Because this was then, of course, part of the Cold War. This was also part of the Cold War. And you can see that in the way that not only the anti-communist speech was also embedded in all this, but also in how the U.S. used the Colombia counterinsurgency experiment also to apply it afterwards in Vietnam, for example, with La República de Marquetalia and the counterinsurgency movement that they established there. That was actually the previous step to the Phoenix program. You know, strong elimination of people program based on intelligence and so on, in South Vietnam. This was actually first tried in Colombia. So
Yeah,
Colombia is also a testing ground.
and of course, Colombia and the counterinsurgency against the left there was a testing ground for the terror wars in Central America in the 1980s.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it was the same template, the same model, and the same model they used in Central America and Colombia. It also has to be, it was the same template applied years after in Iraq and Syria. By the way, in Iraq, by the same very own, the same John Negroponte. But I mean, it is the same thing. It's the same template applied in other places. Same Phoenix program, same Jakarta method logics. It's the same. And it's in Colombia was a major testing ground of this. And then during the Cold War, as one of the Cold War battlegrounds, this is also important because it's also part of a major geopolitical scene, you know, and I think that's also important to remark. And now think about it this way: you have an embattled, battered Colombia, a very stricken Colombia, that also works as a platform of destabilization of its own neighbors, not only Venezuela, also Ecuador, also Panama, and it has been weaponized in several ways. Well, once again, the Operación Gideon was a very good example of that. Also, you covered what they did, the Colombian attorney and all the fake news thing they did, trying to influence on the presidential elections in Ecuador. Same thing. Also, Colombia has 7 U.S. military bases and 2 undeclared ones, so it's around 9 that you have now. And go figure how many lily pads and so on they also have there, and it's also at the same time it it lacks any kind of sovereignty. You know, by the
Well,
way, that this U.S.
one
Georgia
question,
senator
Diego.
called Paul
People are
covered it.
asking,
Yeah,
Diego, what was the name of the documentary that you recommended?
El Baile Rojo, the Red Dance.
Yeah,
El
I'll
Baile
write that.
Rojo, yeah, and I said it, and I didn't say I didn't spell it correctly the first time. El Baile Rojo.
Yeah. So this is actually a good way for me to ask the next question I was going to ask Diego. You kind of hinted at this, but just for people who understand it, just so they can get a better, clearer view. You mentioned that
Sure.
one of the main reasons for the armed struggle in Colombia has been about land. Can you talk about why in Colombia specifically there was never this process that there was in some other countries of land redistribution? And of course, people who just in brief, really quickly, people might know of the colonial history of the hacienda system in Latin America, where the Spanish created a series of kind of neo-feudal system of land parcels and used that to exercise their power over the region, the hacienda system. And in a lot of countries, there was some land reform. In Colombia, there wasn't as much. And today, as Diego mentioned, that there's still a lot of violence revolving around land. A lot of campesino, peasant organizers are killed. And these are people who are they're not even necessarily sympathetic to or involved in the socialist struggle of groups like the FARC and the ELN, the National Liberation Army. They're just farmers, and they're being murdered by Colombian state-backed paramilitaries.
Yes, I mean, I think all land reform initiatives in the whole Latin America are botched processes. That's the first thing. I mean, and they have meant lots of problems in time. But Colombia, maybe Brazil would be the other one, but when Guatemala, the other one, are like extreme cases of how this went completely bad and wrong. The thing is that, yeah, you spell out correctly. The hacienda model has a lot to do with it, and it's not even neo-feudal. It was absolutely feudal. It was a feudal economy and a feudal structure with a insane rentier culture. I think that's the worst part of the Spanish heritage we have, actually, the rentier culture, because Spain never actually developed itself either. I mean, if you compare it to the other countries, especially in even issues of land, because you have like this parasitical class that never actually was concerned about being a class for itself, like the Northern Europe bourgeoisies. I mean, they have the same class issue here in a way, because actually the capitalist development in Spain is it's a 20th century thing. Well, like most of Europeans also, but I mean the land issue was something that it would remain almost intact until independence, that you switch traumatically from an agrarian feudal model to extraction model, adapting to the needs of British capital. You know, so there wasn't actually a thorough land reform, a capitalist classic land reform like the US had or some other countries. So it just leaped from one structure to the other one without solving anything in between. So in Colombia had like the worst part of it all. The thing is that a lot of countries that were able to actually do some things about it at some point. I mean, think about Bolivia. It had also a very strong land reform movement, first in the 48 with the Major Gualberto Villarroel, then the Paz Extensora National Revolution of 52, and so on. And always dwells around land or land abandoning for internal migration to the cities and become industrial workers, of course, and abandoning el campo. But and also you have even uninterrupted slave structures or local economies, caudillista structures that actually were the ones that had their own necropolitics functions, the structure of functioning and also vision of what they would do. Colombia never solved this, but also, and we're getting 19th century geopolitical here. I'm sorry, but this is important too. Venezuela and Colombia are the same thing. Venezuela and Colombia were the same thing. La Gran Colombia, El Libertador Simón Bolívar's project, was a huge landmass that was started in Venezuela, in the eastern part of El Esequibo Venezolano, by the way, down to Bolivia. Then the federation stumbled, and maybe Peru and Bolivia took like a different route, but it still remained being Venezuela, Colombia, and Ecuador. But you have a regional body that faces two oceans, you know, the Pacific and the Atlantic. And the call for unity, Ben, was to build the Anfictyonic Congress in Panama by His Excellency Simón Bolívar in 1824. So what tells you this about what happened next? Once Bolívar is betrayed, once all these countries split and sometimes go into war and sometimes not, but become conflictive and balkanized and confronted among themselves and take different roads, historical development roads. And in the Colombian case, the final winner was the oligarchy that actually inherited a lot of the power from the viceroyalty, because Colombia actually was called Nueva Granada before independence. Colombia, it's a name that honors Cristóbal Colón. Yes, this is 19th century. It's nothing we chose. It was actually first coined by Francisco de Miranda, el precursor, the first guy thinking about Latin American unity, but also Venezuela, of course, that participated, by the way, in the US in the Pensacola battle and also in the French Revolution.
Right,
and also the war against the Holy
Alliance. For people who don't
Alliance.
know this history, I just want to explain, because unfortunately not a lot of North Americans get taught this history. This is extremely important. We're looking here at a map of what Diego mentioned was called Gran Colombia, and this is in 1824. This was created by the revolutionary 19th century, early 19th century nationalist Simón Bolívar. And when we're talking about Venezuelan politics and the Chavista movement, one thing that I think unfortunately is not stressed enough on the US left is understanding how this is not just a socialist movement, but this is specifically a regional movement in Latin America oriented around a kind of national unity project that, if you had to compare it to anything, you could maybe say similar to Arab nationalism. So Nasser and
Or
Syria,
Pan-Africanism in a way.
Pan-Africanism, absolutely, yeah. So, but a famous example would be that under Abdel Nasser in Egypt, there was briefly a unified Arab republic unifying Syria and Egypt into one state, even though they actually didn't have a border next to each other. They were considered one political entity. Similarly, in the early 19th century, what Diego is talking about, and this context is just so important to understand, is that the revolutionaries at this time, who were inspired by the French Revolution, they would now be considered kind of bourgeois revolutionaries, but they were revolutionaries, and they were the ones who overthrew Spanish colonialism. And Simón Bolívar created this state. You can see this map of Gran Colombia, which incorporates all of modern-day Venezuela and Colombia and Ecuador. You can see, and I mean, and Peru and
Panama.
Yeah, we're talking about a massive country, and the point that Diego is making is that project of unifying Gran Colombia once again and unifying Latin America is a very real political force in Latin American politics. And Hugo Chavez, before he was a socialist, before he declared 21st century socialism in 2006 and gave his famous speech at the UN, Hugo Chavez was a Bolivarian, and he was talking about unifying Latin America, the idea of La Patria Grande, the idea of a unified Latin America. So what Diego is getting at here is that when we're talking about groups in Colombia like the FARC or like the ELN, these are not just Marxist-Leninist-inspired groups, which they are to an extent, although the ELN is more liberation theology inspired. But they're also Bolivarian groups. They want to unify Latin America, and specifically, they understand that Venezuela and Colombia are kind of arbitrarily divided on these borders.
Exactly. I mean, and for example, this is very simple, and it has to do also with the contemporary historical development, but it's pretty hard, even myself, for example, not to have a relative, maybe political relative, not necessarily a sanguine one, that hails from Colombia or Colombian friends. They've always been here. I mean, we're talking about 5 million Colombians, approx, living in Venezuela in contemporary. Viva la Gran Colombia, they say there. Yeah, eso es correcto.
Well, and Diego, can you explain really quickly, another point that you mentioned earlier is that Colombia has the largest internally displaced population, IDP population, in the entire world, more than even Syria, which has been totally destroyed by this Western dirty war, to such a degree that something that not a lot of people outside of Venezuela recognize, there are millions of Colombians who are refugees or migrants from the internal counterinsurgency war waged by the Colombian state, backed by the U.S. against the left. They migrated to Venezuela over many years, and there are multiple generations. A lot of them they're now Venezuelans, but they previously, a generation or two before, came from Colombia.
Yeah, that's correct, man. I mean, that's insanely important here, because they try to talk about a Venezuelan diaspora in Colombia and so many people moving to Colombia, leaving Venezuela and going to Colombia, which it was true for I mean, especially in 2018, 2017. It's true, a lot of Venezuelans went to Colombia. A lot of Venezuelans with Colombian origins also went back to Colombia. There's something, Venezuela, Colombia, especially the Cúcuta, San Cristobal, Cúcuta, San Antonio
point, the
Venezuelan. Yeah, it's the most dynamic in the whole Latin America. Even more dynamic and active than the U.S.-Mexican border, proportionally, of course, because it's not as massive as the U.S.-Mexican border, but in proportion, it's even more active than the U.S.-Mexican. That gives you an idea how dynamic this relation has always been, how fluid and how porous this has been, and how, of course, the U.S., CIA, Colombian government also take advantage of this porous situation between Colombia and Venezuela. And we've also seen, which is also extremely important to know, how after this mass migration in Venezuela was stimulated back in 2017, 2018, it was also weaponized, and it's being weaponized right now. Not only, of course, in the obvious narrative, informative way, as in the numbers, the figures that NGOs and some UN agencies or whatever try to sell, because it's always budget behind these figures, but also how it actually works, and actually who got like the biggest share of this population dynamic. And so they talk about like 3 million, 4 or 5 million Venezuelans now outside of that left Venezuela in the recent years, which is not, I think the figure is lower than that, but how the agencies work in this game.
The number is thrown around, the U.S. and a lot of these NGO forces just like add zeros and just make up the number because they're trying to intentionally, they're exaggerating how bad the crisis is. But it's clear. I mean, I believe the Venezuelan government has acknowledged that over 1 or around 2 million Venezuelans have been displaced, and it's because of a conflict. As the millions of Syrians who were displaced because of the war on their country, and the Afghans and the Iraqis and Yemenis displaced. In Venezuela, there is a hybrid war, an international dirty hybrid war on Venezuela that has resulted in the displacement of civilians.
Yes, and I mean, not only that, you also had like these campaigns that stimulated this and gave false hopes about it. For example, this was after July 2017, when the Guarimbas were defeated and the National Constituent Assembly was set. They, in solidarity, the Peruvian government, the Panamanian government, the Colombian government, Lenin Moreno's government in Ecuador, and so on.
All known respecters of human rights.
Exactly, yeah, the best.
All those governments love human rights.
Oh no, and especially of their own people. That's the thing. So they say they were going to be in solidarity with the Venezuelan people and assist them. And of course, how can they assist if they're not even able to assist their own population? How are they going to also assist now the Venezuelans? And this has also created a lot of nasty tension, conveniently used by the respective establishments in Peru and Colombia, for example, right now. And no one actually, Ben, is talking about the massive counter diaspora after the COVID situation, because the same huge amount of Venezuelans have walked back to Venezuela for distance as far as Chile by foot, back to Venezuela.
And the Venezuelan government, can you talk about, there's a plan that's called the Plan Vuelta a la Patria, the plan to return to the homeland. And we've seen huge numbers of Venezuelans voluntarily go back to Venezuela.
Yes, and it also had, by the way, an initiative that has been sabotaged at several points, several times in several places. I mean, the Peruvians sabotaged this. Macri's Argentina also did their own share of work there. Chileans and Colombia. I mean, it has been also made difficult for the Venezuelan people to head back in one of these Vuelta a la Patria initiatives. They're still on, they're still working, and they're still happening as we speak. But it has been also overwhelming, especially during the COVID pandemic, the huge amount of people, Venezuelan brothers and sisters, heading back to Venezuela in several ways. And not only that, they were also, and this is something that has been denounced by the government, our government, the Venezuelan government, they have been weaponized even to infect people with COVID, to come ill and infected to Venezuela and to destabilize and create some sort of imbalance in the way the COVID challenge has been engaged. So, so that was also part. But now we have a more recent thing, Ben, that's also going on because, funny enough, Duque made like an about face turn, and now he's like the most concerned, and he's going to get a huge. It's now giving a lot of quote unquote rights to the Venezuelans because first they said, by the way, that Venezuelans weren't going to get the vaccines in Colombia, the COVID vaccines, and they saw the mess that they had created, and they did like this damage control campaign now and gave like some special status to the Venezuelans in Colombia because it went pretty bad in a PR sense to Colombia because it was pretty obvious what they were doing with the Venezuelans. But parallel to this, another strange thing has been going on, not directly with Colombia, but with Peru and the Venezuelan population in Peru. This is something that I don't think it has made waves yet in the Anglosphere, but it will because they're using it, and I'm sure they want to try at least if they succeed at some point. But there's this xenophobic anti-Venezuelan campaign in Peru that, funny enough, it started. I mean, in the most recent, I'm talking about January, February in here. I'm not going beyond because there have been also another xenophobic campaigns stimulated by other governments like Lenin Moreno's. There was even an anti-Venezuelan pogrom in January 2019 in Ecuador.
Yeah, and really quickly on that note, Diego, I just want to acknowledge, because you should talk about the Peruvian case, but I just got back from Ecuador, and something that's very noticeable is that there are Venezuelans begging in the streets. I mean, the situation in Ecuador right now economically is absolutely horrible. The GDP shrunk by 11% last year. It's the worst economic crisis since the 1999 crash that destroyed the Ecuadorian economy, overseen by the banker Guillermo Lasso, who's the right-wing candidate in the election. But I should mention, though, that in Guayaquil, in the morning I went by the Venezuelan Consulate, it used to be controlled by Juan Guaido and his gang, but now is controlled by the real government again of Nicolás Maduro. And I went by in the morning, and there's every morning, every weekday in Guayaquil, the major city of Ecuador, there is a long line of Venezuelans standing outside the consulate waiting to have information so they can return to the country. And I heard that there was actually a plane, the Venezuelan government was organizing a plane on Conviasa, which is the state airline, to try to bring back Venezuelans to Ecuador who were suffering. I mean, the situation for Venezuelans in Ecuador is awful, but we've seen, like you just mentioned, a lot of xenophobia against them. And what's so crazy is how the Venezuelans are used in a contradictory way as propaganda. So often the right-wing forces will point to the Venezuelan refugees and migrants in the streets and say that that's an evidence of how Venezuela and Chavismo and socialism are all failed, and there's so many migrants because they all failed, not mentioning the war on their country, not mentioning the sanctions and the blockade. But what's interesting is at the same time, some forces will also point to them as evidence of like Chavista infiltration, or they'll use this term Castro Chavista infiltration. So we just saw that Yacu Perez, who's like this fake left candidate, this fake environmentalist who's from a US-backed party who was trying to try to be the other candidate in the election, he just gave a speech in which he was saying that Venezuelans are infiltrating to try to destabilize the country, and they're backed by the Venezuelan government. So there's this crazy thing where the narrative used by the reactionaries is that Venezuelans and these migrants are simultaneously victims of Chavismo, while also they're sleeper cells of Chavismo who are going to try to destabilize the country.
It has been, the Venezuelan population has always been, in recent years, used as a patsy. They were also suggesting that the Venezuelans were the ones that started the unrest in Chile. They said the same thing about Colombia.
By the way,
head of the OAS.
Sorry to cut you off, Diego. Yeah, Luis Almagro, the head of the OAS, Luis Almagro, it gave a speech accusing Venezuela and Cuba of being behind the anti-neoliberal protests in Chile. Insane.
Yeah, it was like an Operación Condor attempt to create this crazy patsy, and he called it the brisas bolivarianas, the Bolivarian breeze. That's like the ghost that haunted Europe back in 19th century. They were saying like this Bolivarian ghost was haunting the streets of Santiago and the streets of Lima and the streets of Bogota and Cartagena and so on. But and yeah, because they try to build like this patsy out of Venezuelan uh, population, but also try to build some foreign policy steps from that point. It's to criminalize even further the Venezuelan population. So now, back to the point, Peru has been going through. I mean, they even killed a Venezuela. There was a famous scandal. They killed a Venezuelan worker in Lima recently because of a video that was leaked in January that allegedly some Venezuelans killed a Peruvian youngster. Guess where? Guess where's this video that actually kind of was like the triggering situation for all this new anti-Venezuelan campaign in Peru started. It started in Colombia. It started in Antioquia. It started in the perfect environment you control, the perfect media landscape you need, and you can control the flow of information there, and from that you can build up until it loses control. And that actually it's something that's in the making right now, and it reminds me a lot of what Yasha Levin has written about the weaponization of migrants and respectable racism also, and how to use as another chip on the board these all purposes now Venezuelans with broken dreams and very hard experience that they didn't went through before once they left following the aspirational dream that a lot of people go after. It's okay, man. That's not a problem. But there you go. I think it relates a lot to the same template they used with the Soviet population
against the Soviet Union. We'll talk about that in a second. I just want to give a shout out because Diego mentioned a good friend of the show and a friend of ours, Yasha Levin, brilliant journalist. And you can see here a newsletter by Yasha Levin, a Soviet immigrant living through American decline. And Yasha's a brilliant journalist who writes also a lot about technology and how a lot of these big tech Silicon Valley corporations all have a revolving door with the U.S. government. They were created by DARPA, by the Pentagon's arm. But Diego, I mean, let's talk more about this point. This is a key point, the weaponization of immigrants. And Yasha talks about it in the context of how during the time of the Soviet Union and the first Cold War, there were these right-wing immigrants who came to Western countries and portrayed the Soviet Union as pure evil, and there was this weaponization. And similarly, we can see something going on with Cuban immigrants. I mean, many of them were the elites who, after the victory of the Cuban Revolution on January 1st, 1959, or even before, they fled to Miami. And we now know that Marco Rubio, his family fled before the Cuban Revolution. They were a very rich elite family, but he portrays his family as so-called refugees of the Cuban Revolution, even though, like many of those elite Cuban families in Miami, a lot of them actually fled before the revolution. But we see the same weaponization of immigrants also here in Nicaragua. The right-wingers who fled to Florida after the failure of the U.S.-backed 2018 coup attempt here, we see the weaponization of immigrants that we see also against Venezuelan immigrants. Diego, I think Diego froze actually. Hey Diego, are you there? Well, I think Diego froze, so while we're waiting for him to come back, I mean, I can just talk more about. I would highly recommend the Immigrants as a Weapon newsletter that Yasha Levin has, because he has so many interesting articles, and there was actually a recent article that was so fascinating about Soviet immigrants who went to Israel, and right here, the Soviet Jews who fled Israel back to the USSR, and there was a guy quoted, a Soviet immigrant who went to Israel, and he actually did an interview. He gave a press conference, and it was actually reported in the New York Times, of all places, back in the 70s. And he said, as soon as you find yourself in Israel, you realize they need you and your family to make it easier to master occupied Arab lands. So, I mean, there's this long history of the U.S. trying to exaggerate the problems in countries like the Soviet Union, and then using immigrants and the plights of immigrants in other countries, and then exploiting their stories to exaggerate the problems. We see the exact same thing going on right now in Venezuela. So while I'm waiting for Diego to come back here, I'm just going to respond to some of the questions. All right, so I'm back here. We're trying to get Diego back. Sorry, there's some technical difficulties here, but hopefully you can all see me and hear me. So there is a question on Patreon from Nancy Ventur, and I want to respond to this. She asked about how in the U.S., there used to be a Citgo gas station in her U.S. It's now BP, British Petroleum, and what happened there. So I just want to explain really quickly what happened with Citgo while we're waiting for Diego to come back. So Citgo was an oil refinery arm of Venezuela and of the Venezuelan state oil company PDVSA, PDVSA. And what happened is that at the beginning of the coup attempt with Juan Guaido, the U.S. stole Citgo. I mean, we're talking about, Diego earlier was talking about how what the U.S. has been doing to Venezuela is straight up robbery. I mean, it's piracy. And so what the U.S. did is they took Citgo, because that was the oil refinery arm based in the U.S., in Texas specifically, and then seized all of Venezuela's U.S.-based properties, and then used that as money to fund the shadow regime of Juan Guaido, which was never elected. I mean, I often joke that if you, as like a joke, if you ever gone to vote in the U.S. and you like wrote your name on the ballot as like a joke, as a protest or just for fun, you got more votes than Juan Guaido ever got to be president. He has won a whopping total of 0 votes to be so-called president. I mean, he won a few thousand votes to be a member of the National Assembly, which he no longer even is. But then the U.S. used his position in the National Assembly to recognize him as the fake interim president. Well, when his fake shadow regime, the Venezuelan government in exile run by Guaido, they didn't have tax revenue because they didn't actually control anything inside Venezuela. So what the U.S. and the European Union did is they stole all of those Venezuelan assets located abroad. So the U.S. stole Citgo, and then the Bank of England stole the billions of dollars of gold that Venezuela had, and a Portuguese bank and other European banks stole that money. So getting back to Citgo, the reason, this question from this patron at Patreon, I mean, the reason that it's now a BP is probably because Citgo has been hemorrhaging money and has been financially not solvent because, surprise, surprise, the Juan Guaido coup gang can't run anything. I mean, their whole plan was that they were going to the U.S. was going to try to force them into power, and then they were going to try to privatize everything and then use that to fund the government. But they were not able to do that. So now there's actually been a huge economic crisis within Citgo, which is not financially solvent. And we've seen that the Juan Guaido cabal has been collaborating with these corrupt corporate lobbyists like Carlos Vecchio to try to privatize their own, Diego's back, to try to privatize their own oil arm, Citgo. So we've seen not only looting on behalf of the U.S. government and the Europeans, but we've also seen that the Guaido coup gang has been trying to loot their own Venezuelan state oil arm and sell it off to the highest bidder, sell it off to these U.S. multinational corporations. So, I mean, it's really incredible what we're talking about because, people say that the Guaido people are corrupt, but we're not even just talking about corruption of enriching their own pockets. We're talking about them selling out their own country. I mean, in Spanish, there's a term. The term is vende patria, which the kind of unofficial translation is a traitor. If you're called a vende patria, it means traidor, you're a traitor. But if you literally translate vende patria, it means selling the homeland. And that is the definition of what Juan Guaido and his coup gang has been doing. They've been trying to sell off state assets. So anyway, we're trying to get Diego back here. For people just joining, it looks like I think maybe Jimmy Dore finished his stream because our number has been increasing now. So we're not competing as much with Jimmy, who's a friend of the show. He's got a great stream of his own. So while we're waiting for Diego to come back, I'm going to address some more questions here. And so anyone who has questions here, go ahead and ask some questions. And we're not going to go too much longer because it's been over 2 hours, but I do want to try to get Diego back before we conclude here. So someone asked what vaccine is Venezuela using? So Venezuela has been getting the Russian vaccine, the Sputnik 5. And what's really fascinating about this is that the US government and the media for many months has been pushing this narrative that the Sputnik V or Sputnik 5 vaccine of Russia is not tested, that Russia's going to use you as a guinea pig and all this. It's really crazy. It's funny because like the same media outlets that constantly criticize anti-vaxxers, I mean, rightfully, they all became anti-vaxxers when it came to the Russian vaccine. We now know because of the Lancet Medical Journal, which is the leading medical journal, that the Russian vaccine is one of the best vaccines. So now, ironically, there's a lot of countries competing to try to get the Russian vaccine, but Venezuela was one of the first countries to sign an agreement with Russia. Russia actually just sent a bunch of the Sputnik 5 vaccines. And here in Nicaragua, Russia just announced that it's donating a lot of the Sputnik vaccines here. So while in the US, the richest country on earth, a lot of people can't even get the vaccine, Russia has been exporting the vaccine. Also, the Chinese and the Cubans have their vaccines. So there's another question here. Moderate Rebels is doing live streams now. Sick. From Captain Waffles. Cool photo, I guess. So yeah, we're trying to grow this YouTube channel. So while everyone's here, it would be awesome if you could go down below. I think it's on this side. I don't think it's over here. If you can go down and subscribe, that would be really awesome. We're trying to grow. We have the Gray Zone channel. Of course, a lot of our stuff is not promoted in the algorithm, and we're facing kind of shadow banning. So we're also trying to diversify and grow this channel at Moderate Rebels as well and have both of them. And we can, we're trying to do more live streams on both. So let's see what other questions we have here. Just as I'm waiting, unfortunately, sometimes because of the blockade, because of cyber attacks on Venezuela, sometimes the internet cuts out a lot. It's not very strong. And I'm trying to see if Diego can come back here, but let's see what other questions we have. So, this is this is great. The Revolution Will 23. Great comment. I can't believe Nicaragua passed a law requiring foreign agents to register. Who do they think they are? I know. Who do they think they are? Like, do they think that they're the United States? Because that's exactly what the U.S. has done since they've done that for 80 years. There's a foreign agents law, the Foreign Agents Registration Act, FARA, in the U.S. And I'm just going to explain this really quickly because this is like a really hilarious scandal that's going on, like a fake scandal. So the National Assembly here in Nicaragua, which is a democratically elected body, and the majority of the seats are controlled by the Sandinista Front. They were elected, the socialist anti-imperialist party. They passed a law that requires so-called NGOs funded by foreign governments to register as foreign agents. Controversial, I know. I mean, it's been a U.S. law for 80 years. And this is an important issue here in Nicaragua because in 2018, there was a very violent coup attempt backed by the U.S. and supported by many of these NGOs, so-called NGOs, these opposition groups, and they've been funded with millions of dollars from the U.S. government. So I wrote an article about this at the Gray Zone, looking at how USAID, the so-called humanitarian arm, the U.S. Agency for International Development, it sounds so great. We're going to help develop. I mean, it's actually really just a soft arm of the CIA. And USAID has spent millions of dollars funding these groups that were involved in a right-wing coup attempt in Nicaragua. And so one of the main groups, which is called the Violeta Barrios de Chamorro Foundation, which is named after the former right-wing president of Nicaragua, backed by the U.S., a major U.S. puppet. Her party was funded by the NED, the other major the CIA cut out, the National Endowment for Democracy. So after she left power, and just after she privatized a lot of things that had been nationalized by the Sandinistas, after she sold off Nicaragua's railway. I mean, she just screwed over Nicaragua. And then after she left power, she created the Chamorro Foundation, which has constantly been a source. The U.S. launders money through it. The USAID uses the Chamorro Foundation to send millions of dollars to Nicaragua, and then the Chamorro Foundation gives that money to right-wing forces in Nicaragua to try to overthrow the government, to support coup efforts, to train right-wing media propagandists. So the Chamorro Foundation announced that as a form of protest, they're going to refuse to register as a foreign agent, so they're closing their operations in Nicaragua, which means they're just going to go to Costa Rica, which is the southern neighbor, and they're just going to continue their coup operations there. But this was portrayed in the Western media as that the Nicaraguan so-called regime forcing so-called NGOs to register as foreign agents, not mentioning that they're funded with millions of dollars from the U.S. government CIA cutout, not mentioning that they were involved in a violent coup in 2018. And then now we saw that the first mention of Nicaragua by the Joe Biden administration was Ned Price, who is now the leading State Department spokesperson. By the way, he was formerly a CIA agent. So I want to stress this point. The main State Department spokesperson under Joe Biden is a former CIA agent. And as we all know, there's not really ever any former CIA agents. There's very few people there are like John Kiriakou, who was imprisoned for being a whistleblower, or like Ray McGovern, who was a whistleblower. But basically, 95% of former CIA agents are still CIA. So Ned Price, anyway, he released a statement accusing Nicaragua of being on the path to dictatorship, and he accused President Daniel Ortega of passing the law, even though it was the elected National Assembly that passed the law. And by the way, Nicaragua is on the path to dictatorship. Well, I guess that means the U.S. has been has been a dictatorship for 80 years, because this law that Nicaragua passed is exactly the kind of law that FARA, the U.S. has had in the books for 80 years, and that in the past few years, the U.S. has used this foreign agents law to force Russian and Chinese media outlets to register as foreign agents. So, the hypocrisy knows no bounds, but we have our friend Diego back. We lost him for a second there, Diego.
Hate sanctions, man. I hate sanctions so much.
I know. So bad. So Diego, we lost you there, but we're over 2 hours here. We're not going to keep you too much longer. I know it's late there, but I just want this is a good question. I actually don't know, Diego. Is it still illegal to be a communist in Costa Rica, in the great democracy of Costa Rica? Do you know?
I'm not sure. I've got to check. It wouldn't surprise me anyway. Costa Rica, it's like, I don't know, it's like if the Nicaragua or Venezuela or Colombia in its own sense are like the testing grounds, the violent testing grounds, Costa Rica is like the showcase testing ground, as a whole managed republic in every sense of the word. And the function that Costa Rica has played, especially during the 80s insurgency wars and counterinsurgency, was actually pretty descriptive. Also, in the last part, as in being the mediators, and then you remember this now disgraced, happy enough disgraced Oscar Arias, which actually is a Nobel Prize winner, was like the major figure in the Contadora dialogues and in looking for peace in Costa Rica, the same way as Santos or the same way as Obama in 2009, and now he's disgraced because he was going through one of those sex abuse scandals, which speaks volumes of the kind of heroes the West needs in order to represent him.
Well, it also says a lot that when when someone like Ivan Duque, the far-right Colombian U.S.-backed president, when it's known that he used a drug dealer's money, Nene Hernandez's money, to buy votes to steal the election, not a single peep in the U.S. English language media. But when there's some spicy sex scandal, oh well, whatever. Whatever. It's ridiculous. But Diego,
Yeah, exactly.
there was a question that someone asked on Patreon, and it's a funny question because it's another example of this media propaganda manufacturing these fake scandals. And Dwayne McCormick asked on our Patreon, when he saw propaganda that when Hugo Chavez was still alive, they claimed that his daughter was a billionaire. so
Oh yeah.
what's this whole thing and like the tabloid fake media stories claiming that Hugo Chavez's daughter is like a billionaire?
Well, those are soft targets, you know. It's media soft targets, and yeah, they try to they try that with his younger daughter, and then with one of the older ones, as in being multi-billionaires. But where's the evidence? I mean, yes, I mean, I think that it was the case of Maria Gabriela, which was part of the UN delegation, Venezuelan delegation team there. So yeah, it's pretty dumb. I mean, there's no actual. If you want to see corrupt millionaires, you can just go check what's going on in the U.S. But I mean,
Or go to Bogota, go to Colombia. I mean, come
oh,
on.
that's a wonderful example. Also, yeah, it's just crap. I mean, all these kind of insidious spins they're gonna go after, and of course they love to attack in all the possible ways, in all means possible, the Chavez symbol and everything that goes orbits around him. So they're going to look for each and every way just to show how to vulnerate this image and to give that. It's part of the same series of psyops. You know what I mean? So they
Yeah,
try,
well,
and it's also
Diego, it reminds me of there's this insane propaganda technique that these Western governments and media outlets will use, the fake news media, where they claim, for instance, that Putin is like the richest man on earth because they conflate Russian state assets with Putin as if they were his personal private like property. And then they did the same thing with Muammar Gaddafi in Libya.
Exactly, that's what I was going to say.
They claimed that he was the richest man ever because they claimed that like all of the Libyan state assets were his personal assets. So I mean, it's just insane propaganda. It's so absurd. Meanwhile, Jeff Bezos is a 200 billionaire and controls the Washington Post and however many other institutions, and has a huge contract with the CIA. And meanwhile, I mean, we have these insane like these just stupid billionaires who don't produce anything. Like, I mean, the latest. I mean, Elon Musk is now supposedly like the richest man on earth. He doesn't produce anything. He's a con man. Like, what has he actually done? It's all marketing. And now, like, and supposedly Tesla has a larger market share than like 10 of the largest car manufacturer companies in the entire world combined. Whereas Tesla makes like several, like a few, like 10, like 60,000 cars or something like that. Meanwhile, all of the other Ford, Toyota, Honda, all of them combined have less value. I mean, that just shows how dumb. Like, billionaire wealth is all fictitious capital, and it's all the only reason they have that wealth is because the U.S. government protects them.
Well, and you also have the self-made man myth there, you know, as in Elon Musk being some sort of accomplished man that could, you know, rise to the top, and he was actually a guy whose father was owner of several diamond mines and so on in apartheid South Africa, and that's how he grew up and he got his capital. And it's the same thing with Bezos. The myth that he started as at their parents' garage is also utter bull. And with all of them, I mean, it's the same propaganda attempt to sell them as wonderful figures. And I can't forget, I will never forget nor forgive Elon Musk talking about we throw coups whatever we want. Talking about the Bolivian coup in 2019, which is like the first Great Reset coup, by the way. It's like the first green economy coup. That also speaks volumes of where capital, late stage neoliberal capital, is going. But giving a step back on what you were talking about, about Gaddafi and Putin and their wealth, remember that they took all this gold reserves from Gaddafi, from the Libyan state. Sorry,
It was
saying
stolen
it was
during the NATO pillaging, you mean? Because
and so they did.
Gaddafi was trying to create a gold-backed Pan-African currency that would get off the petrodollar, and that was one of the key reasons for France really initiated the war, the NATO war, and then Britain and the U.S. under Hillary Clinton, of course, led the war, and they stole all of the gold, and then they pillaged the oil, which went to like French and British oil companies, and then all of the weapons from Gaddafi's arms cache there was a rat line the CIA used, which was exposed by Seymour Hersh, and they sent all those weapons to the Salafi jihadist groups in Syria.
Syria, yeah, but they did the same thing to Venezuela. They stole. The Bank of England has been confiscated 31 tons of gold, Venezuelan gold, that was in their vaults, and trying to give it to the fake central bank of junta of Guaido, and withholding it from the Venezuelan legitimate government on the ground that's going to be used for corrupt ends and corrupt interests. And basically, they're also stealing 31, something around $100 million worth in gold. I mean, which is actually extremely needed by Venezuela now to actually curb and deal with the pandemic and the emergency that means. So that's a legal battle going on about this, which is also, if you see it from another angle, it's pretty stupid. I read a BBC piece on it saying that the thing is that the UK government didn't actually know who to speak to, so they just withhold it. I mean, it went from acknowledging Guaido, and now that's something that's going in courts to say that we can't move it because we can't give it back to Venezuela via the UN because for purchasing medicine and food and nothing else, because it's not defined who actually is the one ruling Venezuela, governing Venezuela. That's what they argument. I mean, and that's what they also the legal buffet that represents the Guaido fake government says. And so that's the controversy now. They weren't able to do the same with they did with Gaddafi for a lot of reasons, but it's the same principles, it's the same logics behind it.
Yeah, I just want to highlight probably the most important comment of the night. Thank you, Elizabeth. you rebels are handsome. Thank you, Diego. It looks like you got fans abroad. So if the journalism
awesome,
thing doesn't
man.
work out, you have a backup career. You can fall back on.
Well, yeah, I'm gonna see through that one. Let's see where that goes.
There's no greater pillaging than America's pillaging of South America than sugar. I just want to briefly acknowledge that this is actually it sounds like it's not a huge issue, but actually this is a very real problem. And we saw that Andrés Manuel López Obrador, the progressive leader in Mexico, has made this an issue because there's major problems with obesity, problems with, horrible health issues, especially right now with COVID, because there's a lot of people with diabetes because they drink so much soda. And it's something to think about. Not a lot of North Americans know about this, but in the U.S., as people realized that soda was just an insanely destructive, awful drink. It's just like pure sugar. If you look at the amount of sugar in drinks, and the insane public health damage it was doing, like cigarettes. It's like this addictive substance that does major public health damage. So a lot of people in the U.S. stopped drinking soda. There was like public health campaigns. So then all those companies just went to South America, and in Mexico, in Central America, it's a huge problem. So that's an interesting comment. I mean, I mean, in places like Venezuela, which has like a huge list of just insane problems like a blockade and hybrid war, and that's not one. It's not in the top 100, but it is an interesting issue.
Well, it is
And
because I mean, it has to do with patterns of consumption. Of course, it has to do. I mean, sometimes you think the only actual invasion we have, for example, it's going to be a military one, but you have that one precisely. You have that food culture invasion. You have the same thing going with agribusiness, and I mean, you have like this invisible occupation of all our territories, not only Venezuela, but all these places that goes through that via food, for example, which is a huge issue. So the thing is, it's not so visible or so spectacular as coercive unilateral measures. But it's also true. I mean, the thing is, of course, we're talking about consumption patterns here. It's also a very important discussion, and back in 2015 and 2016, this was a major discussion about this, about what you were able to actually eat or buy, and how a lot of people started quitting a lot of these products because they were not willing to pay, because they realized that they actually suck and they can find better options. I mean, that was one of the positive virtuous sides of the struggle. That's one of the luminous sides of the
yeah,
whole
I noticed of the blockade.
resistance. You know,
I noticed in Venezuela that
exactly,
Coke
because I
is
mean, you
insanely
think about
expensive.
this.
Like Coke has
Yeah, I mean,
become like
I've
associated
never,
with the
I
the
never
right
drink
wingers.
Coke.
I mean, it's awful. It's
I only
poison.
drink Coke when yeah. I
It's
only
North
drink Coke
American
when I
poison.
have a strong hangover. That doesn't happen that much. but yeah. But that's the thing. I mean, this has also had, and I have to highlight this because it's something that there's not much talking about this, or it's been told the wrong way, the most entrepreneurial way. But Samir Amin, the great Egyptian economist, once said that culture, it's all the ways the 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 worth of value of the valor de uso, the worth of the value of use expresses itself. And Venezuela has gone through a very creative revision of all this because Venezuela was one of the most I mean, the consumption here was something crazy, and it made a lot of sense when we had like a lot of money and a lot of people were actually excluded from this. But this has also been part of what has been deprived for the population during this whole hybrid warfare period. So a lot of creative things have been going on how to substitute some of these basic needs for some much cheaper and healthier options and local. This is huge, man, and it's something that, of course, it's an uneven thing, and maybe it's not a thorough, comprehensive one, but it's happening also. This is very, very, very important because it has a lot to do with local consumption, and it also has to do with community organizing. And this is also happening. And not only that, I mean, and also there are several. This is maybe a middle class thing, but it's not bad also either. I mean, a lot of entrepreneurial initiatives on how to buy things, or how to do things, how to produce things, how to trade. You know, that this is also happening. I'm not saying it's a success story all by itself, but we have gone through this several high points of this kind of experience of exchange and production and discussion on what we should be consuming. And this is also thanks in a way to sanctions. I'm not saying, oh, it's thanks to sanctions our lives are improving. It's not true, but it shows another way to deal with this capitalist culture issues.
Yeah, well, and this also gets to the one of the most fundamental political questions for any country, which is food sovereignty. And we've seen, I mean,
Exactly.
the political and economic situation in Haiti, where it's just been colonized by the United States, and This is a country that used to produce its own food and is now reliant on importing like like fake food products, like this like rice that's just like barely rice that the U.S. just throws at Haiti and just floods Haiti and destroys the local food economy. It was the same thing that NAFTA did to the Mexican agricultural sector,
Yeah, indeed, indeed.
destroying Mexican agriculture and replacing it with these big ag corporations. And then here in Nicaragua, food sovereignty is a huge issue because
Yeah.
the Sandinista front has put a lot of emphasis on working with campesinos. The government works a lot in food production, and Nicaragua is food sovereign because the Sandinista front learned and that during the U.S. terror war in the 1980s, when the U.S. had a blockade of Nicaragua, like the blockade of Cuba and Venezuela, the
Well,
Sandinista front learned that they have to produce their own food. So now Nicaragua is completely food sovereign. So if the U.S. does try another blockade, and we'll see what they try this year because it's an election year, Nicaragua it's still able to operate at a basic fundamental level because unlike Venezuela, unfortunately, which is so dependent on imports, Nicaragua can actually still continue to feed its people. And if you can't feed your people, you can't govern, obviously.
well, Nicaragua has, and this is something I know for a fact, it has like the most robust cooperative systems in the whole hemisphere. And not only that, I don't know if these recent years, but I know for a fact, like 10 years ago, for example, there was they have like this surplus of agriculture goods. So now you could find like frijoles, beans, with with the tag say hecho en Honduras or hecho en Costa Rica, hecho en Panama or whatever, and actually was actually produced and packed in Nicaragua with that, but with that tag. It was like some concession on trade. But I mean, that's how far and how effective the whole cooperative network in Nicaragua is in the agricultural field.
Yeah, and in Nicaragua, there's of course also a very similar. I mean, in Venezuela, there's a very similar network. So I want to wrap up here, Diego, because we're over
Yes.
2.5 hours. There's a
Yeah, it's pretty
there's a
long.
few. Yeah, I know it's late for you. Sorry. There's a few
No
questions
problem,
though from
man.
people
My pleasure.
that I wanted. No, yeah, it's been a good conversation. I always love chatting with Diego. He's brilliant. He's also just a good friend of us, so it's always fun to talk. So, and in fact, there was a question about this. Some of the co-ops in Nicaragua and Venezuela. I would highly recommend, just to answer this person from the Revolution, Will, that there's some good reporting on this in a website called Tortilla con Sal. I'm posting it in the comments. Tortilla con Sal, which looks at the co-ops in Nicaragua, and there's interviews with people. There's a few other questions. Someone asked, Diego, this is a really good question. If you can briefly explaining the difference between the FARC and the ELN. And this is Colombia.
Yes, no, that's that's a key question. It's very important. Absolutely. Well, the difference is the oldest Marxist guerrilla formation would be the ELN, LN. It was actually founded by two Spanish Jesuit priests. And also, I mean, that first generation was basically exterminated. And then it was Camilo Torres Restrepo, also a priest, very strongly influenced by the liberation theology, but also a sociologist himself, that created the next generation of the ELN, which also had like a substantive influence also of Guevarismo. Las FARC, it has a different story, and you have to check out the two first founding generations of La FARC, because the first one actually were liberal campesino leaders such as Manuel Marulanda or Mono Jojoy, that actually came from the liberal struggles in the 50s and during La Violencia, that developed to further discussions with Jacobo Arenas, by the way, as a worker leader. They got into the communist organizing. So, and that first generation started relationships also with the Soviet Union. And actually, the second generation, where Timochenko, Alfonso Cano, Pablo Catatumbo, all of them actually are from Soviet formation. They're actually urban cadres that actually went through the communist orthodoxy. But they also adapted. They revised and reformed themselves, and they created the Bolivarian movement also. But that's the key difference. Those are the major developments, and it hasn't always been a harmonical relationship, and it depends on where in the region also, because they were able at some point. The highest point actually of this guerrilla success was during the early 80s and in the late 70s with La Coordinadora Guerrillera Simón Bolívar, which was like the umbrella front for all of them, because they started to coordinate military operations among themselves. But this was La FARC, this was El ELN with its Guevarista liberation theology profile. It was also El Ejército Popular Libre, or the EPL, which was Maoist. And it was also the M19, el M19, which was like a radical democracy nationalist movement that evolved from the ANAPO party, and El Comando Quintil Lame, which was an indigenous guerrilla structure. There was all these guerrilla formations given fighting and coordinating and being successful about guerrilla struggle. And this is actually the moment when the government starts to develop conversations and peace talks that ended up in political participation in 1984 and with the creation of the Unión Patriótica.
Which we were talking about earlier, which was exterminated by the Colombian regime.
Exactly, but it was actually after a successful military campaign. That's what and also this also explains the rise of paramilitarism, because all the classic counterinsurgency measures didn't succeed anymore. And for one close moment, it did happen. The FARC and the ELN were close to the cities, man, which was going to be the game-changing situation. And the U.S. and the Colombian government knew this. And so that's why they have to rely on different parallel structures and methods to actually roll back on the successes and make them retroceder, go back, take steps back, and but at some points there have been even conflict between them, armed conflict in some regions in Colombia in the past. Especially I remember the Arauca situation, the El Departamento de Arauca situation a few years ago, because we can't neither idealize the whole war in Colombia, and not even this armed structures, because at some point there's also a lot of lumpen situations, a lot of deviations, a lot of major FARC cadres and ELN cadres actually joined the paramilitary forces afterwards. There are some uncomfortable nuances to this, but it's also fact, it's history, and it also has to do with the vilification of everything because of the drug war, because of the U.S. war, and because of basic territorial control. That's basically it. That doesn't mean that the whole thing it's been a criminal enterprise, because it's not true, but it has had criminal sides to it. The other thing is that La FARC had a different process this time than the ELN in peace talks, with the outcome that we already know. And the ELN in this case actually also wants to go into peace talks, but they're not trying to make the same moves that the FARC did. So that's why they haven't pacified completely, and that's why they have make like demonstrations of goodwill first that usually are betrayed at early stages. So they don't like give up everything at first, because they will have their own experience on being betrayed.
Yeah, well, so there's another question related to that. Before we're going to wrap up pretty soon here, but I just want to acknowledge this comment from Unbeliever Free Assange. I forgot what news was till I found Moderate Rebels, and by extension the Gray Zone. Thanks a lot. It means a lot.
Nice.
I just wanted to say that, of course, that we're on Moderate Rebels on the YouTube channel right here, but of course anyone who's not subscribed you should go to the Gray Zone and subscribe to our YouTube channel there. And you should also check out Misión Verdad. I'm going to write that in the comments. Misión Verdad
Thanks, man.
is the website that Diego helps run. Brilliant website. There's content in Spanish and English. Diego, one of the last questions here before we wrap up, this is also from Hernan Montoya, and it's a good question. And there's an election coming up in Colombia as well, although now the latest news is that Iván Duque, the president, said that he's going to try to extend his term in office for 2 years because COVID is an emergency. So we see another example. We kind of obliquely referenced the Great Reset. We see so many leaders try to exploit COVID to their advantage. So
exactly.
But assuming there is going to be an election coming up, this is an interesting question. Can the left mobilize in Colombia? Do you have hope that someone earlier asked about the last election in which there's actually a lot of evidence that the left-wing candidate, Petro, that he actually won, and Gustavo Petro, and that actually it was stolen from him because of or he would have won, but it was stolen from him because of, I mentioned, the drug dealer Nina Hernandez and the corruption of Duque. So do you think that progressive forces and even Bolivarian forces in Colombia have a chance of coming to power?
I'm not too optimistic about it, to be honest. I don't think there's not a unified left, and I think there's a major, or not a major, but a significant split between social movement, student, young left, this systemical left, such as Gran Polo Patriota, Polo Democrático, sorry, and the Colombia Humana party of Gustavo Petro, for several reasons. The thing is, for example, and this is from my point of view, I'm extremely critical of Petro. We don't ask as Venezuelans to Petro to become Chavista or Gustavo Bolivar or all of them, but don't be such an assholes about Venezuela. I mean, they try to even compare Nicolás Maduro to Iván Duque as like, the same tyrants and so on. It's like an anti-Chavista left, which is pretty stupid, and also it's inaccurate. But I know even in that case, if they got to win, it's going to be better for us. We're going to be better off. Absolutely. It doesn't matter. We don't like each other. But I mean, that's a pretty soft, weak message. And it's not the same message that some more radical youth has. Thinking of the Venezuelan relationship at first, but secondly, on how they know Venezuela is not what they say it is. It's not that demonized entity they say it is. And you can see there's a lot of discussions about it. And as long as this left coalition doesn't actually embrace actual unity, actual Bolivarianism, and it goes beyond the progresista bullshit, it's not gonna go far enough. There are lots of Bolivarian elements that are not part of the armed struggle that exist, but also Bolivarianism in Colombia has a different tradition. It has a lot to do also with the Conservative Party, by the way, because the liberals are the ones that inherited this Francisco de Paula Santander, which was like the major enemy of Bolivar in Colombia. And it's the founder of the Liberal Party. So that also has something to do, it's related to that. But on a grassroots level, they understand Venezuela. Lots of people are actually grateful of Venezuela because they've been here and they've lived here and they've been protected here and they were able to actually thrive here and they head back. So it's a split opinion about it. And also with, I think, identity politics and all that progressive kind of things also has a saying here. And also sometimes it doesn't work as a positive force, more like a negative one. I'm more akin to think this in Gramsci terms, as in, it would be the optimism of will, but the pessimism of reason here. It's possible because people are actually fed up, and most importantly, they're actually fed up of Uribismo. which is something that didn't happen so strongly before 2019. So this is very important. Notwithstanding such a shitty establishment that also involves part of the left, and notwithstanding the anti-Bolivarian, anti-Chavista left that they got there. But I think, but on the other half, Colombia has a very well prepared, smart left. We have also to acknowledge its popular forces. I mean, you have brilliant cadres, individuals and structures there that actually exist, and they're actually able to survive or not, or are facing this threat, of course, but they are very virtuous and smart. So you also have those factions, and you also have what actually is going on inside the Colombian military, because there's also critical thinking there. I'm not saying there's a Bolivarian movement brewing in the same lines that Venezuelan had in the past, but some things are also happening there. So we have to be, it's not a definitive situation, and things could change, and there could be some game-changing situation. I hope they are in favor of the Colombian people. Any moderate but strong enough option that's able to actually confront both the Uribismo and the Colombian oligarchy, which is a major thing, it's going to be good for Colombia. And we have to be behind it. It doesn't matter if they hate us stupidly as Petro does. But I mean, nothing is said here, and we're also inside of a crazy Tyson zone. That's also why the whole extermination is going on, because Colombian people has also reached critical mass about the need of change, and to go beyond the established leadership. So we have to wait and see and hope for it too.
Yeah, speaking of that extermination, just in 2020 there were 91 massacres, over 200 people killed. So I mean, 200 social activists killed. It's crazy.
But it's a massive figure.
And of course that gets almost no coverage. Whereas in Venezuela, Maduro sneezes on someone and it's headline news. I mean, whatever. Like,
absolutely, yeah. Well, cherry picking.
So just a few comments here before we wrap up. The Nicaraguan Revolution, the Sandinista Revolution in Nicaragua turned food sovereignty on its head, importing 70% now. They're totally food sovereign. It's incredible, yeah. And they're very proud of it here in Nicaragua. They protect their people from natural disasters. That's true. In Nicaragua, there were 2 recent hurricanes, not just 1, but 2, and very few people died, and the government provided a lot of support for rebuilding and evacuating people, whereas in Guatemala and Honduras, it was much worse, where they have right-wing neoliberal governments. So wrapping up here, just looking at a few of the more comments, I want
to add up something with this, Ben, with these comments about Nicaragua. And you can say the same thing, for example, especially in the pandemic context, about Venezuela and Cuba. But beyond that point, you can say the same thing about the other countries, such as Colombia, Chile, and Brazil about it, and how precisely not doing anything for their own population, or Ecuador, for example, it's actually a declaration of principles. As the same way as this response to the crisis from Nicaragua, it's also a declaration of principles of the state declaration of principles of what are state's priorities here.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's prioritizing people, and that it's honestly, it should be what every government does, but of course it's not what they do. There was another comment here, Diego. I'm trying to find it, but it was a great comment I agreed with. Someone said, right here it is, "Bring the people the Diego show." I agree.
I need to find better internet first.
Yeah, but hopefully, my idea actually, one of the reasons I'm trying to build out this channel as well at Moderate Rebels is so we can have kind of more one-on-one casual conversations like this. And then at the Gray Zone, we have like the group together. So yeah, I mean, I hope to bring back Diego, and I mean, he's a close friend and friend of the show. So hopefully we can do this kind of regularly, like every few weeks or month or so, we can have this long conversation. I mean, honestly, there were so many
with
other
a better
things
connection.
I wanted to... Yeah.
In my case, I mean.
Yeah, I mean, I also wanted to talk about the insane anti-Russia hysteria, all the stuff, the accusations of genocide against China and the new Cold War, because I mean, Diego knows he's a walking encyclopedia in Latin America, but he also is a really good geopolitical analyst, and there's a lot to talk about there. But we'll have to do that because we're rounding up almost 3 hours
for next
here.
episode, of course. For the next episode.
Yeah. Well, I think I answered most of the questions, and I want to thank everyone for commenting. Diego, I'm just one second here. I'm just gonna try to. All right. So Diego, just wrapping up. Looking forward, this is the last question I'll ask, and then we'll conclude. This year seems like it's a pretty important year. In Ecuador, I just got back. There was the first round of the election, and the Correístas won the first round in a landslide. Although, of course, we'll see what happens in the runoff election in April, if there is one, if it's not delayed. And we saw that in Bolivia, the coup regime failed. The U.S. was unable to push out the MAS forces, the movement towards socialism forces. We see that in Brazil, Bolsonaro is losing popularity, and the extent to which he even had a kind of political base in the state, I think, is exaggerated. But now he just mostly has military people. So in Brazil, it looks like Bolsonaro's forces are losing power. So there is this narrative that the so-called pink tide is coming back. Of course, I know that you're not a huge fan of that term, but the kind of progressive governments, and specifically, like, I agree with you. I don't like the term progressive very much, but not just progressive, but even more important, anti-imperialist forces that believe in sovereignty for their nations and believe in la patria grande. They believe in the mission of uniting Latin America. We saw, in fact, this week, I was actually pretty surprised. We saw Alberto Fernandez, who is the center-left kind of progressive leader, bring that term back, of Argentina. He's not bad, but he's also gone out of his way. Yeah, but he's gone out of his way to intentionally to not form an alliance bringing in Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua. And there's been this attempt by some kind of progressive milquetoast center-left forces in Argentina to build a kind of new unified left that excludes what the U.S. called the so-called troika of tyranny. You could call the troika of resistance. So they themselves also agree with John Bolton. Even though they're more progressive, they agree to exclude Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba. So, but surprisingly, we saw Alberto Fernandez this week. He went to Mexico. He met with Andrés Manuel López Obrador, the progressive president in Mexico, and he gave a speech in which he called for unifying La Patria Grande from the southern cone from Argentina all the way up to Mexico. So, I mean, that was a pretty interesting speech for someone like Fernandez, who is probably the most centrist of the left-wing leaders in Latin America. So, given that scenario I just laid out, I mean, what are your thoughts on this idea of the so-called pink tide coming back to Latin America, and of the right-wing forces who in the past several years took power through coups and soft coups and a few elections? Do you think that they can be defeated again?
Well, there are good signs. I mean, the Bolivian experience is like the most spectacular one of them all, because it was a coup thwarted in almost less than a year, which actually says a lot of things. And I think it's not going to be the same thing, because, of course, I mean, there's no Chavez there, for example, which was like the major driving force in this, or Nestor Kirchner, or even Lula at that moment. But you have two things. You have three things. You have some political leadership that learned the hard way from experience. You also have a population, people that also learned the hard way what the real options are, politically speaking, as in, think about the Argentinian or the Bolivians or the Ecuadorians. You have people that actually went through processes. In this case, I think the most accurate would be Argentina, which was fairly electoral, the way it changed from Cristina to Macri, for example. But they learned also that lesson.
Although, Diego, there are accusations that Macri also used drug money involving Colombia and Venezuela, right?
Because there was also a lot of dirty tricks, and they're always accumulating much more dirty tricks. And Ecuador is the most recent example of this, and they're going to keep trying it. But you have those two options, those two elements, I mean, and you also have a third one, which is a new generation. And youth, it's become a battleground. I mean, the whole youth means, I mean, I think it's insanely stupid, but it's a fetish that gives a lot of leeway to a lot of disgregating forces, as in identity politics and so on and so on. But also it gives you the other part, which is also radicalization. So you have like these three intertwined experiences of history that are also like going on at the same time, that are going to be decisive also in how this new tide is going to, if it's going to happen, how it's going to break down, how it's going to happen, yes. And you still have something that's going to be pretty dangerous, which is also you have got Democrats now, which are pretty good at controlled.
That's a great quote, Diego. You also have something very dangerous, Democrats.
Yeah, I mean, because they won't have any problem with a progressive alliance that excludes Kissinger style and other powers, radical powers such as the Troika of resistance that you just named, So that's a major risk there. And it could be so easily, if it's not clear enough what sovereignty and independence and unity is about, it could happen. And it could be a tragedy, actually, as in something, a way to contain Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, and probably Bolivia. And bear in mind something also about the Argentina, and especially Argentinian foreign policy. Alberto Fernandez doesn't control everything, and he has to do a lot of negotiations with the right-wing Peronismo of Sergio Massa, which is actually the head of the lower chamber now, and the guy that's actually Foreign Minister Solá, which is a U.S. pet. It's from the Massa group, so that gives takes away a lot of maneuvering power to Alberto Fernandez. Even though I think that doesn't make a huge difference, because I think Alberto Fernandez is dishonest about things, lukewarm and so on. But I always trust in history in this case, and he could also be better, like we just seen. So it's a possibility, but we're talking about here one more time what this historian Arno Meyer talked about, the furies of history. I mean, it's a tour de force here also, and it depends on how all the forces, revolutionary, radical, nationalist, whatever, and on one side, also the counter-revolutionary, reactionary, and conservative on the other one, actually try to operate here. But this trend, as it is right now, I think it's extremely positive, and it's actually coming out from a very nasty cul-de-sac if you think about the recent years, especially the years that span from 2015 to the Bolivian coup. Because there's also the experience on how useless, worthless, and mean and cruel the other governments are. And I'm thinking about the Chilean government, the Colombian government, Bolsonaro in Brazil, Macri, and so on. So you have 10 more years of experience here. It also includes Honduras and Paraguay, for example, which were the first to be overthrown in the process. But you still have people, because also in Paraguay, the Lugo could be becoming a strong option again. So there are new elements that can be used in the proper way, or they can finally condemn us definitively, as a region. So it's also an open question, but it's a possibility, yes. So the fact that it is a possibility, and you can't be automatically pessimistic, it's always good in this case, especially from the Venezuelan side, because we were practically left alone by Latin America, with, of course, the always honorable exceptions of Nicaragua, Cuba, and Bolivia.
Yeah, the troika, I guess you'd have to expand it to like the tetrarch of resistance. But the last comment,
yeah,
the last comment I want to end on here, which is really good, is, oh, this one's good too. Hopefully, Central America and South America will get help from Russia and China. In fact, we'll save that for next time. I want to talk to you. Well, I'm going to have Diego back on soon, and we're going to talk about Russia, China, the new Cold War in Latin America. That was one of my intentions, but the
But we could just
conversation
say
flowed.
shortly, I mean, if it wasn't for these two powers in the big power game, it would have been even harder for us in Venezuela and for the other countries to actually engage in their own realities. That was it.
Absolutely.
That was a comment.
Yeah, I want to talk about that. In fact, like I said, that was one of the ideas with this conversation, but we're at 3 hours, so I'm going to conclude in a minute here. But I'm going to have
Yes.
Diego back soon, and we're going to talk about the new Cold War and how Latin America plays a key role. And all these U.S. think tanks, we constantly hear about China's doing business in Latin America, etc. But the final comment I was going to end on from Mulkey here is, I wish South and Central America would form a defense union to protect themselves against the North. And I have to say that there were the beginnings. We saw the origins of such a union at the peak of the so-called pink tide, that wave of progressive anti-imperialist governments in the region. We saw the creation of the Union of South American Nations, UNASUR, and we saw the creation of the ALBA, the Bolivarian Alliance, a trade alliance for the peoples. And the U.S. went out of its way so hard to destroy both of those organizations. The coup in
And they
Honduras, one
actually
of the...
and they actually
Yeah.
delivered one. They were able to actually fracture UNASUR, but they weren't able to, or they didn't succeed with ALBA. And ALBA, it's going to be the engine that's going to bring UNASUR back if we go through this line, you know. And you know something, in 2009, 2010, the UNASUR created the Regional Defense Council, which it was meant to exclude the U.S. So that kind of that was the first, it was a mild step. It was significant, nevertheless, and it was also rolled back, but for all these reasons we were talking about. But there was the first experiment. And remember something else, which is pretty crazy. But Gaddafi proposed a Southern Atlantic Treaty Organization back in the day. He also did that. But
Oh man, based. Oh, a
yeah,
SATO as opposed to
yes.
NATO, make a SATO. Oh man, based.
Yeah, the tragedy didn't happen, but I mean, but it's on those lines. Yeah, if you don't have a strong defensive component, you're not going to be able to actually achieve the whole thing. And so I do agree. The east part there, I'm not gonna agree with her. I mean, because she said the north
Yeah.
and the east in the comment. China's not a threat. China is not an imperialist force here. It's a superpower, of course, and so is Russia. But it's not the same approach that the U.S. has, ever, not even close. But I understand that's part of the progressive part. I will also address one last thing, Ben. If you want to see the difference between what a progressive and a radical is in this case, usually progressive are against the state as itself, but us are against empire. There's a main dividing line between these political forces, and that's what actually makes the whole difference. And that's how you know at the service of what you are.
Well said, well said. I think it's a perfect note to end on. And this is so true in the United States and the North American and Western European left, that the dividing line for me is not like what you think about, like the labor theory of value and whether or not you agree with like a particular Marxian analysis of surplus value, whatever. No, I mean those questions are sometimes important, but the fundamental division in my view is the contradiction of empire and the fact that imperialism is the central contradiction, and the left that there's a lot of people on the left say they're anti-imperialist, but they don't do anything to challenge empire. For them, it's one issue on a laundry list of issues with climate change and LGBT rights and abortion and and the minimum
You know,
wage and
identity
unions.
politics in general, yeah, as in
Yeah,
a
and like,
fragmentation. Because well, I mean, those are all major discussions. I'm down for speaking about abortion and LGBT rights and so on. I mean, it's not an exclusive for them. It's not an exclusive
of
for all those
course,
civil society organizations and progressives. But yeah, it's not the key issue. Not now, at least. I mean, we have like pretty much more urgent ones because all those deconstructed topics were the ones, those single topic campaigns were the one actually the ones that actually gave some sort of sense of morality to the empire's regime change adventure, for example, in Syria or Libya.
exactly, exactly. So, I mean, that's obviously, I mean, this is music to my ears because anyone who follows me or Max Blumenthal, my colleague and co-host, we, you know, that's what we spend all of our time focusing on as journalists, as people. That's what our lives are devoted to, is prioritizing anti-imperialism. So, Diego, I mean, it was such a pleasure. I mean, I can't believe 3 hours already went by. It was really fun. And I know it's late there in
Yeah, it was.
Venezuela, so I'm going to let you go. But I
No
just want
problem
to,
about that, man.
yeah, I just want to conclude here again. While we have Diego, I would highly recommend going to misionverdad.com, and I'm going to write that in the comments one more time. And there is a Spanish and English language version, and you can find Diego's work there. He's done some stuff with us at the Gray Zone. And Diego, I guess do you have anything to plug at the end here?
No, man, let's leave it for the next episode. I'm just gonna say thank you so much for the attention and the comments and the participation. I think without that, it wouldn't make any sense. Besides, oh, of course, they're fun and we always enjoy this long conversations, but without people's input, it would be. I mean, it would be just a much more short experience. So I'm actually pretty happy that a lot of people actually went through all 3 hours with us here. So that must mean something. And thank you. And of course, fight on. I mean, support Venezuela, support our truth. We're actually fighting the same enemy. It's just on the other side of the thing. And actually, there's no way that you can actually achieve any of the social conquest or social importance to solve the social issues back in the States without thinking about imperial foreign policy. So we're the same. At the end, we're on the same battlefield. Maybe different side with different positions, but it's the same.
Absolutely. Beautiful note to end on. I'll just say that anyone listening, because I'm also going to turn this into a podcast, who can't see the screen, I would recommend also following Diego on Twitter at Quera Else. You can see on there, and Queraelse. So definitely follow Diego. He's a friend of the Gray Zone. He's my Venezuelan brother from another mother. And
That's right.
great. Well, thanks everyone for watching and listening. I just want to say we're at 223 people watching, which is amazing because we actually have twice as many as we
Three
had at the
hours,
beginning.
man.
After 3 hours, I think that's mostly because we were competing with another friend of the show. We were competing with Jimmy Dore at the beginning. But the last thing I'll say is I'm going to be that guy. Thanks so much, Diego. It was great talking to you. Everyone watching here, go here. Please subscribe to Moderate Rebels. Subscribe to our channel. And I'm going to do more of these streams in the future. So that's it. Thanks a lot, everyone. Talk to you later.
Thank you, man. Thank you, man. Bless you. See you soon, by the way.